mother of two, loses her life.
The kids discovered her.
Oh my God.
She loved them boys. It's been really tough on everybody.
And now her family must bring the killer to justice.
The kids are the key. They are our best shot at finding out who we're after.
She got beat and she got raped. By him?
We've told her in the past, he's gonna hurt you. You need to stop.
The police and Stephanie were a team.
The last location known was the bus station.
She finds all the breadcrumbs. The phone's moving from here to there.
Nino stepped up and agreed to testify.
The defense was attempting to shade her character.
The defendant explained away all the circumstantial evidence.
He's going to take the stand. And I'm thinking, oh my God.
For those most affected by a homicide, the first 48 is just the beginning. This is the story of the fight for justice. In the weeks, within minutes, the parking lot of an apartment complex becomes a crime scene.
Morning, sir. How are you? The only details we got were there's a female found in the back of her vehicle, and it looks suspicious.
She's in the fetal position, right here.
My name is John Brown. I'm a police officer for the city of Tulsa. I'm currently assigned to the homicide division.
Head over here where that blood is, feet over here.
They had already removed her from the car for the medical examiner. So I didn't get to see how she was actually placed in the vehicle, which wasn't great, wasn't ideal, but it is what it is.
Naked, 2 blankets covering her up.
No keys, no cell phone.
And who's that gal?
Car is checked back to Spence with Michelle.
34-year-old Michelle Spence was born and raised in Tulsa. A single mother, she worked as a dental assistant to support her young sons, Nino and Rion.
I feel like her neck looks kind of swollen.
Is this a bruise?
The medical examiner believes Michelle was strangled.
Strangulation. It's usually personal. Somebody had to get up close to her, and most people, if you don't know somebody, aren't going to let somebody up to you close to strangle you.
How far in rigor is she?
Investigators think Michelle has been dead at least 20 hours.
The kids discovered her.
Oh my God.
They hadn't seen Mom.
When their mother went missing, Michelle's sons set out to find her. Their search took them 2 miles from home.
As they're walking, they recognize the van. And then find her in there, and then she goes and find someone to call police.
They should not have to discover their mother dead in any circumstances, and they shouldn't have to discover her dead and naked at the same time. I'm Sergeant Dave Walker, and at the time of this murder, I was the sergeant supervisor over the homicide unit.
14-year-old Nino and 10-year-old Rion are still on the scene.
Okay.
What do you want to do with the boys?
I'm gonna need them downtown.
See if they can fill in some blanks about Mom and Mom's behavior and see what the kids can tell us.
Why did this happen? The kids are the key. They are our best shot at finding out who we're after.
2 hours in, Rion is joined by his grandfather.
The kids are going to be tore up. They just saw their mom dead. But we have to interview them, and that's hard to do when you're feeling the caring heart of an adult to a child. But we have to get that done.
Nino, we interviewed them separately. because everybody's going to have a different story. I took the oldest boy. I figured he would have more information about who was mom with or where'd she go. Nino, I need you to help me out. You just can't come in there all authoritative and scare the living daylights out of these kids who's already been scared. You have to, bring it down a little bit to a softer level. Hey, I'm John. Got to ask you some crazy questions. Do the best you can. When was the last time you saw your mom?
Thursday evening. She came home.
Nino says after his mom finished work last night, she dropped Rion and him off at their dad's house.
Okay, so you guys are at Dad's house Thursday. Friday, come and go. Did you hear or talk to your mom?
He says when they couldn't get a hold of their mom Friday night, their grandfather drove them back home.
Do you remember the house being locked up when you got there?
Yeah, it was locked.
You guys walk in, anything odd or?
Well, the lights was on and her TV was on. It was strange.
They lived with her. They know a lot more of what's going on than we as adults would like to think. What made you guys go looking for her?
I felt like something was wrong.
Why do the kids walk from their house to discover the body? I mean, that is a big thing that we have to figure out.
We went to go look for him. I was kind of worried for him.
You walked down the street?
I saw her car, and then we started walking around the apartment, calling her name. And then Neil looks in the back. She covers and down just stacked up. And feels it. And it's her. Didn't have any clothes on. Nothing.
I've got kids, I know I care. But I know also you just take that moment and say, I gotta get this job done. And then you shut that off. Because our job is find the killer.
Why did you go that way?
We're going to go see if she was at her friend's house.
And what's her friend's name?
Renez.
Rion says Renez lives across the street from where he and Nino found their mom's body.
How long has your mom known Renez?
Since I was like in 5th grade.
And what grade are you in now?
8th.
Is this your mom's friend or boyfriend?
It used to be her boyfriend till he beat her. Her in the hospital.
When did he do that?
2 years ago. All I remember, she got beat and she got raped.
By him? He knew that mom had been raped and strangled a few years back. But the crazy thing is, that guy was still familiar to these kids. Were the police called?
I don't know.
You may not know this answer. But why would your mom continue to be friends with him?
He said he wouldn't do it.
You have to try to keep an open mind with what you're hearing and what you're seeing. Not just getting the tunnel vision on Mama's ex-boyfriend. Hey, he's a suspect. Did your mom have any other male friends or?
Yeah, she had a couple of them. She had one friend named Michael.
Yeah.
I don't know his last name though.
Or with the kids saying that mom sees multiple guys, it just opens up the door to more potential suspects.
Hello? What's up, Steve?
It's Michelle's sister, Stephanie.
Put that on speaker. He deleted his Facebook page totally. His Facebook page is gone.
It's been really tough on everybody. The part that really bothered me a lot was the fact that the kids found her in the back of her car. I wasn't there to help them through it. My name is Vicki Spence. Michelle and Stephanie are my daughters. Michelle was the oldest. Stephanie was born 10 years after that. Watching Chloe feed the squirrels reminds me of when Michelle used to feed them.
Chloe is Stephanie's daughter, and she was Michelle's niece.
Look how pretty she was. Michelle, she was a good mom. She loved them boys. It's what happened with Michelle. Left 2 kids with no mom. You have to grieve for a certain period of time. You have to support each other. It's important to keep Michelle in their life, you know, even though she's not physically there. There's so many good memories. We're gonna hold on to those.
I must be a mama.
Uh-huh.
Four hours into the investigation, Michelle's sister, Stephanie, arrives at headquarters.
Yeah, if you will have a seat. Okay.
Renez is always around Michelle. There's something to be known about Michelle, he's gonna know it. So I messaged him. I said, have you seen Michelle? He said, no, I seen her Monday. We don't talk much nowadays. He said, she's got different guys she's seen nowadays. I said, she's dead. The cops found her dead in her car. And he said, oh my God. He said, my phone's about to die. I'm so up over this. And then he deleted his Facebook. As soon as I found out that she was in the back of her car naked and dead, I knew automatically right there it was Renez.
Why?
He's done this to her in the past.
She says in 2013, Renez allegedly assaulted Michelle.
They ended up getting into an argument. She said he threw her in the back of the car and he tied her up with the scarf that she had around her neck. She said, I literally thought I was gonna die that night. And I took her to the hospital that morning. She couldn't walk.
So why did she get back with him if this happened?
She likes the gifts and the money. He used to have flowers delivered to her every week at work. He keeps giving and giving and giving to her. And he gets to that point where he's not feeling like he's getting anything out of Michelle, and then he goes back for revenge. It's all about he's wanting sex and Michelle doesn't want to give him sex. We've told her in the past, he's gonna hurt you. You need to stop. We've all told her this.
So with that, I start digging through reports. We need to figure out more about Renez.
Renez Bramlett is 44 years old.
It looks like he drives a dark green 1994 Cadillac Seville.
In 2003, he was convicted of assault and battery and domestic assault against another victim. He served nearly 4 years in prison.
And we're going to go back to 2013 when our victim made a police report alleging that she was assaulted by Mr. Bramlett.
Michelle had accused him in the past of strangulation and rape.
I believe the victim did not want to prosecute at the time.
Why did Michelle not have a protective order against Renez? There are many people that are caught in domestic violence situations that are still with these individuals.
They just say all the nice words that they want to hear and promise they're going to be better. Then it goes right back into that cycle of violence.
The family has jumped out on a limb saying it's Bramlett.
But they're looking at all of his other priors. There's nothing that jumped out and says, hey, you go from an assault to a murder.
His past history does raise suspicion, but that doesn't mean that he's the killer.
You start getting television on just one suspect. You have blinders on, you can't see anything else that's around you, and you're focused on one individual, and it's not your actual suspect.
5 hours in,
Goal to be able to locate Renez and see what he's got to say.
the team heads to Renez Bramlett's apartment.
Renez Bramlett! Tulsa Police! Come to the front door!
It'd be nice if you could find some drag marks in the dirt with some blood.
No, there's nothing.
Looking for Mr. Bramlett, we searched the parking lot. No signs of his vehicle, no signs of Mr. Bramlett.
The next morning, detectives head back to his apartment complex, this time hoping to turn up any witnesses.
95% of these murder victims are killed by somebody that they know. It's not necessarily the hardest part to figure out who did it. It's proving it.
Police? Did you see something after your last time?
How are you, sir? You got a minute?
Yeah.
Your husband says you may have seen a little something that seemed odd to you yesterday?
Yesterday, before 2 a little bit, I saw the one out the door, and I saw 2 the bag.
The neighbor says that yesterday afternoon, she saw Renez leaving his apartment.
It looked like a travel bag with this color.
And she tells us he's got 2 suitcases with a flowery print on those suitcases. And she said, I thought that was kind of strange for a masculine guy to have such suitcases.
It's all about little pieces to the puzzle.
I'm guessing if she sees him with 2 bags, he's leaving town at 2 o'clock yesterday afternoon. And we find her body at midnight. It helps me with the sense of, if he says, man, I was in freaking Nantucket 3:30 yesterday afternoon, you know, that ain't happening. It's better than a sharp stick in the eye, but it's not as good as a back rub.
I tend to believe that Renez is leaving for some reason.
At this point, we don't have enough information to arrest Bramlett. It's real easy for me to think, yeah, you did it. We've got to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. We're behind the 8 ball trying to get the evidence necessary to prove it.
38 hours into the investigation,
Homicide Brown.
Michelle's sister Stephanie has found a new lead.
I got onto her Gmail account last night, and I went into her location history.
Unbeknownst to us, Stephanie is working on the Google account.
Okay, we will head your direction, and I can talk to you face to face.
Okay, that sounds fine.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
This was her Gmail account associated with that phone. And here's the map.
Using Google's location tracker, Stephanie was able to retrace Michelle's cell phone location the day her body was discovered.
She finds all the breadcrumbs that the phone's moving from here to there. So it was kind of eye-opening to me.
The last location known was the bus station. 1:47 p.m.
GPS puts Michelle's phone at the bus station, 10 hours after she died.
After she's dead, who would have moved their phone? The killer had moved it. So if we find a connection between that phone moving here and there and Bramlett, it's huge.
I seen that and I was like, aha.
Stephanie is headstrong. I mean, when the detective told her, well, you can't just point your finger at one person with no evidence. You're gonna have to come up with something we can go on. And she said, okay, I will.
Stephanie says, hey, this is the information that I've got that I can help you out with. So, good team effort.
It was almost like him and Stephanie were a team when they were coming up with all this stuff.
Off to the bus station.
Kind of some good stuff on the Gmail account there.
40 hours in,
You'll look your side, I'll look mine.
Kennedy and Brown search the bus station parking lot for Renez's car.
For a green caddy.
How about a green caddy right over here? Is that a caddy? It's green.
What's it on?
But the plate number doesn't match Renez's car.
Damn it!
You get a little frustrated, you just have to be patient.
Maybe we gotta get the VIN number off that thing.
Yes, I need the last 6 of the item.
844063.
That's the car.
Wow.
Tow it, get a warrant, get it processed, and see what's in it.
Inside the bus station,
I'm looking to see if that guy got on any of the buses getting out of here. March 20th, in the afternoon. It appears that Mr. Bramlett caught the 2 o'clock bus out the 20th, headed for Chicago. Not a lot of folks, if they had nothing to do with anything, run for any other reason, change tags on your car, park your car, and then take a bus out, so.
10 hours before the body's discovered, Bramlett's on the move to Chicago. It's very damning, him fleeing.
If he's not guilty, he's sure done everything to make himself look at it.
I would concur.
as the first 48 winds down.
It's frustrating that you have the right individual, but yet you don't have enough evidence to put them in jail.
Brown still needs to prove Renez was with Michelle the night she was murdered.
Well, I'm going to start typing on a warrant for his records.
We need his cell phone records, because if we can get his phone tracking in the same places where she's at, that would be awesome.
Almost 2 weeks into the investigation,
These numbers match. She's the lavender, the pink color.
the team gets Michelle and Renez's phone records.
We used the help of Kurt Bickle, who's a mapping expert.
Anything to do with Bramlett's blue. The last ping was 218.
We're able to plot which towers her phone's hitting off of. We then start getting towers for Renez Bramlett's cell phone.
Here's number one.
Kurt's able to create a map where it shows Michelle and Renez's phone running together.
So we're starting out when she arrives home, and then everything just flows.
The team thinks Renez killed Michelle near her home, then put her body in her car. Her phone arrives at the lot near where he lives after 2 a.m. Then, they believe he walked back to her place to get his own car.
It shuts off until 8:44, and we get another hit, putting it right next to his apartment.
That's when they suspect he packed his bags and took her phone in his Cadillac.
All the way to the bus station. I mean, they're connected throughout the entire period of time.
We've got a map so you can see it and be able to say, aha, he's here. So we started hitting every place that we could find along that route. And with that is a Quick Trip. Quick Trip has phenomenal video. Detective Kennedy is able to find a Mercedes SUV, which is what Michelle drove.
Sure enough, 5 hours after detectives believe Renez left Michelle's body in that car,
there's an individual walking that we believe is also going to be Mr. Bramlett. The physical and the time frame fits.
But that still doesn't prove Renez was with Michelle.
I wanted to be able to sit there and look Renez in the eyes and ask him some questions, then be able to say, I'm ready to charge him. Everything kept adding up to saying, hey, it's Renez.
19 days into the investigation.
So with that, we took everything that we had to the district attorney's office, said, hey, we need to talk to Renez Bramlett.
In Oklahoma, if an officer has probable cause, then they can issue a material witness warrant to track someone down, try to locate him before making that ultimate decision of, are we charging him with murder in the first degree?
The DA issues that warrant, and over the next 3 months, Brown and the Chicago PD try to track down Renez.
This morning, I got a phone call from the Chicago PD that Mr. Bramlett is in custody. It's been a long few months. It is, one, a sense of relief and elation that, hey, he's finally in custody. Two, it is, holy crap, gotta pack our crap and get to Chicago and interview this guy.
How do you know who I am, man? Some of the paperwork, plus my mom told me. Your mom told you? It was Brown looking for me. Well, how'd you know it was me, though? It could have been somebody else they sent down here to come talk to you. Brown? Yes, sir? It sounds like a black man. I understand. Well, since you know who I am, this is Detective London. So, give me your perspective of your relationship with Michelle. I love her. She's my best friend. Even though Michelle had a breakdown. She just went on a party spin. I try to keep her grounded. She didn't want no part of it. Sometimes she wanted to be carefree.
I wasn't ready to say at that point in time, there's not some other boyfriend we don't know about, or some other guy we don't know about.
So was she intimate with other guys? Yes, always.
What if there's that outside chance? If there's anybody else in her life that would have done this? So I didn't know whether one of these different guys was jealous of her relationship with Renez, or Renez was jealous of her relationship with these other guys.
I mean, you still go by to see her, though, right? Last time I seen her was the Monday before St. Patrick's, having St. Patrick's party with her friend.
Renez claims the last time he saw Michelle was 3 days before she was killed.
What's going on in my mind is he's just locked himself into a story.
Your phone puts you in the street out in front of her house. It's my phone, yeah.
What is important about Bramlett's interview is that he denied any other contact with her, except for earlier in the week. That denial just flies in the face of the cell phone evidence. It's as good as a confession.
Renez is extradited back to Tulsa and charged with Michelle's murder.
This is only gonna take a couple minutes. Yep, that's yours, man. Even though Renez has been arrested, this is still not a slam dunk because you still have to get up in front of the jury and prove this is the guy.
August 2015. It's now up to Assistant DA Kenneth Elmore to prepare the case for trial.
We have an abundance of circumstantial evidence, but there wasn't direct evidence.
You'll open up for me? That's it.
As part of the investigation, swabs were taken from Michelle's body, and some of those swabs had foreign, unknown DNA. This DNA could be the real killer.
If the DNA belongs to Renez, that could further prove that he was with Michelle the night she was killed.
Any questions for me, Mr. Bramlett? The judge and jury, they want evidence, they want proof, they want a smoking gun. So hopefully we have a hit with the DNA.
The lab results finally come in.
Foreign DNA was not Renez Bramlett's.
The defense is going to ask and say, hey, well, where'd these come from? If you don't know, they may have a chance to be able to succeed in getting their client a not guilty verdict. There is no murder weapon per se. There is no eyewitness to these events. There is no smoking gun that says, hey, Renez Bramlett did this.
The prosecution does have one key witness who has inside knowledge of Renez's violent history: Michelle's son.
Nino knows more about the family history and the family drama. The information we needed from Nino was explained to the jury who Renez was to Michelle.
All I remember hearing, she got beat and she got raped.
By him?
We wanted to set that tone a little bit so the jury would understand this is a very violent and very horrific homicide.
Before trial, we met with Nino. We would go over potentially what we would anticipate for the defense to ask. Nino, he was very stoic. He wanted to be strong, I think, for his little brother. Nino took the reins for him, I think, because he was just so young, and Nino was very protective of him. And I think that's why he stepped up and, agreed to testify.
September 13th, 2016, the trial of Renez Bramlett begins.
Nino was the first person they put on the stand. Nino always tries to act like a tough guy, but he said, I really don't want to sit in the courtroom with him sitting across the room knowing what he did. I said, you don't have to do this. It's totally up to you. He said, I'm going to do it for Mom.
The case was my first time being selected for jury duty. With Nino being the first witness, it really set the stage for an emotional setting.
It was difficult, but Nino did a terrific job of testifying about who his mom was and what he saw.
On cross-examination, defense attorney Marnie Hill tries to take the heat off Renez.
By asking Nino about, didn't your mom date a lot of people, the defense was attempting to shade her character as such a way of telling the jury, oh, well, she runs with all these shady people. The defense used that as an opportunity to say somebody else must have done this.
Nino was on the stand and she basically asked Nino, well, who are these other men that your mother was hanging around? And basically insinuating that she was promiscuous. Nino started crying at one point. He got agitated and just let him know, you're okay. You did awesome. You did this so Rion didn't have to.
I just felt so much sympathy. My heart just went out to him. The defense attorney is trying to establish not only has she been with other people, there's evidence when you have DNA on her and it's not the person you're claiming did the murder, then it starts lessening the strength of the prosecution's case. This starts giving Renez avenues of, it wasn't me, it was whoever left this DNA here.
But the prosecution has another way of connecting Renez to Michelle on the night she was killed.
This cell phone evidence was some of the strongest evidence that we had. What we're able to do is take a combination of the Quick Trip videos, the cell phone records, the Facebook records, the Google records, and the security footage, and we're able to create a pretty consistent timeline of the movements of the handsets as well as Mr. Bramlett's movements and the movements of the cars at various points in the timeline.
Then, On day 3 of the trial,
Renez was going to testify. He now has to try to provide some plausible explanation to go with this cell phone information.
We were all surprised that he took the stand.
I was shocked. I know from what I have seen, what I have heard, you don't take the stand. It could sink you.
I'm waiting to find out what is going to be Renez's defense for why he was at her house, why he was at the crime scene, why he was walking back up and down the street, why he had her phone.
Renez has one chance to explain away all the evidence against him.
His attorney, she's like, okay, well, he's going to take the stand now, so now we're going to hear what really happened that night. And I'm thinking, oh my God.
The defense attorney is trying to establish Renez's story, but they did not know what he was going to say on the stand.
A year after Michelle's murder, Renez Bramlett takes the stand in his own defense.
He told the jury that, yes, he did smoke PCP with Michelle that day.
She wanted more. I asked her, give me your phone, so I know you have to come back to me. I know you're safe.
His story to the jury was, oh, well, I'll stay here, but I'll keep your cell phone to make sure that you come back so you don't ghost me. And so it kind of explains the cell phone evidence.
Renez testifies that while Michelle was out buying more PCP, he fell asleep playing video games.
I woke up the next morning. She wasn't there.
He says he walked back to get his car at Michelle's house.
Then at some point through Stephanie, Renez found out Michelle never came home.
Renez claimed he panicked, believing the drug dealers Michelle went to see might come looking for him.
Renez testified, I got scared and I took off to Chicago. I think the prosecution, they were taken a bit aback that he explained away all the circumstantial evidence that Michelle went through a drug deal that went bad. That's the story I took with me into the deliberation room.
To be honest, I thought he did a good job.
We started discussing Renez's story and how valid it was.
After 3 hours and 40 minutes of deliberations,
we receive a note that the jury wanted to watch the actual Quick Trip video. We don't know what it is that they're wanting to take a look at.
The prosecution's claim is that Michelle's SUV is going south. Renez is the driver. Michelle's body is in the back. Renez is saying the two of us were driving back. I said, well, let's look at the source video. This is the surveillance video from Quick Trip. This is Michelle's SUV. As her SUV is coming south, we could see that there's only one person in that car, and the passenger seat is empty.
There's a little coffee shop. I went down there and got us a cup of coffee, and by the time we were getting ready to leave, I got a phone call. The jury's back. I was like, uh-huh. My biggest concern was that he never be out on the street to do that to somebody else.
Watching those 12 people file in and sit down, you're going up a roller coaster right before you go down that hill.
Now at the Tulsa County Courthouse, Bernice Bramlett was on trial for the murder of Michelle Spence. Fox 23's Lynn Casey joins us live with a verdict.
The jury just came back minutes ago that they have in fact found him guilty of murder in the first degree.
As soon as we were done that video, that's when Renez's story blew up. He lied on the stand in his sworn testimony. And we all went back, and it was 12 votes guilty.
Verdict of guilty, which was a good feeling and something that he absolutely deserved.
Renez Bramlett is sentenced to life without parole.
Justice is always a hard thing to define because there's no ability to restore what was lost or what was taken.
Was justice served? No. If you ask those boys of Michelle, was justice served? I don't think it brings justice or closure. I think it is a sense of still being lost without a mom.
And there's Aunt Muffy and Rion when he was just little.
And I see Nino's little bit hair.
Yeah. I was really concerned about Nino because there was times he got in trouble at school because someone would say something about his mom. He had been known to lash out. I told him, you don't fight with him. You just say a prayer for him because that's what they need. And there's Rion when he graduated from kindergarten.
Wait, you can graduate?
Yeah, he graduated from kindergarten.
Cool.
Nino had called me and he said, what happens if we go into foster care and me and Rion are separated? I said, that's not gonna happen. So I met with his dad's side of the family and I said, I will take them and they can live with me. So everyone was in agreement with that.
Vicky moved into Michelle's home with her grandsons.
So we were like a whole family in this house that she had.
The first thing investigators noticed was not the blood, it was the silence. On a cold Tennessee morning in 1989, a small community woke to the kind of quiet that feels normal until someone realizes a familiar face is missing. By sunrise, 22-year-old Laura Bennett had vanished. Her car was still there. Her purse was still inside. One shoe was found near the edge of a wooded road, turned on its side as if it had been kicked away in a struggle. There was no note, no goodbye, no explanation, just an empty space where a young woman had been only hours earlier. At first, police treated it as a missing person case. People disappear. People leave. People make decisions their families do not understand. But Laura had not taken clothing. She had not withdrawn money. She had not contacted friends. And when detectives entered her small apartment, they found something that made the disappearance feel different. Her bedroom window was unlocked. The curtains were moving in the morning wine. On the kitchen table sat a half-finished cup of coffee, still marked by the faint outline of her lipstick. Laura had apparently been preparing for an ordinary day. Then something happened, something so sudden that she never had time to finish what she started. The town of Blackridge was not used to violent crime. It was the kind of Tennessee community where people recognized the cars passing through, where neighbors knew which house belonged to which family, where a strange vehicle could become the subject of conversation before the evening news. Laura worked at a local medical office and had recently started taking evening classes. She was described by everyone who knew her as dependable, private, and careful. She did not disappear without warning. Her mother knew that. Her closest friend knew that. Even the detective assigned to the case understood it within the first few hours. Something was wrong. By noon, officers had searched the apartment, the surrounding streets, and the wooded roads outside town. By nightfall, volunteers were carrying flashlights through fields and drainage ditches. The temperature dropped. Rain began falling. Every passing hour reduced the chances of finding Laura alive. Then, just after midnight, a volunteer spotted something beneath a cluster of trees nearly 3 miles from town. It was Laura's jacket. The fabric was torn along one sleeve. There were dark stains near the collar, and inside one pocket was a small silver key that investigators could not immediately identify. The discovery changed everything. Police stopped searching for a woman who might have left voluntarily. They were now searching for a crime scene. The wooded area was sealed off. Detectives moved slowly beneath the rain, photographing footprints that were already beginning to disappear in the mud. Near the jacket, they found broken branches, a crushed cigarette pack, and a narrow trail leading deeper into the trees. The cigarette brand was common. The footprints were damaged by weather. The key opened nothing Laura owned. There was no body, no weapon, no obvious suspect, only fragments. But one detail disturbed investigators more than the rest. A tire impression had been found near the trailhead. It belonged to an older vehicle, possibly a dark-colored sedan or station wagon. Someone had driven into the woods that night. Someone had stopped there, and someone had left. For the next 3 days, the entire county seemed to search. Posters appeared in store windows. Radio stations repeated Laura's description. Police interviewed co-workers, friends, former boyfriends, neighbors, and anyone who had seen her during the final 24 hours. One witness claimed she had seen Laura standing outside the medical office shortly before 8 that evening. Another remembered a dark sedan parked across the street. A third witness reported hearing a woman's voice near the wooded road around 10:30. None of them could agree on the exact time. None could identify the driver. The investigation began to fracture under uncertainty. Every clue opened another question. Every answer created another possibility. Then came the first major break. A mechanic named Daniel Mercer contacted police and told them something he had initially considered too insignificant to report. 2 nights before Laura disappeared, a dark sedan had been brought into his garage for repair. The driver had asked him to fix a damaged rear light. Mercer remembered the vehicle because the driver seemed nervous. The man had kept looking toward the street while speaking. He paid cash. He left quickly. Mercer remembered the license plate number only partially, but detectives were able to trace the vehicle to a local construction company. The car had been assigned to an employee named Thomas Reed. Reed was 31. He lived alone. He worked nights on construction sites outside town. He had no major criminal record. He knew Laura. That fact emerged during the first interview. He had met her through a mutual acquaintance and had spoken with her several times at a local diner. Reed insisted they were not romantically involved. Laura had rejected him once, he said, but there had never been an argument. He told detectives he had been working outside town on the night she disappeared. His supervisor confirmed that Reed had been scheduled for work. For a moment, the alibi appeared solid. Then detectives checked the time card. Reed had clocked in at 11:47 p.m. Laura was last seen around 8. 3 hours had disappeared. When investigators asked where he had been before work, Reed changed his answer. First, he said he had gone home. Then he said he had stopped for gas. Then he claimed he could not remember. Detectives searched his vehicle and found nothing directly connecting him to Laura. No blood, no clothing, no weapon, no trace evidence that could survive in court. The tire pattern from the woods was consistent with several vehicles, including Reed's sedan, but it was not unique. His story looked suspicious, but suspicion was not proof. Then the case went cold. Months became years. Laura's photograph faded on bulletin boards. The volunteers stopped searching. The television cameras disappeared. Her family continued looking, but the town moved forward. New houses were built. Businesses changed owners. Children who had watched the search grew into adults. The wooded road where the jacket had been found became overgrown. The name Laura Bennett remained known to those who loved her, but for everyone else, the case became a sentence repeated whenever old mysteries were discussed. There was no body, no confession, no arrest. The cold case sat untouched for years until technology finally began opening doors that investigators in 1989 could not even imagine. In 2017, a newly formed cold case unit reopened Laura's file. The detectives began with the evidence that had survived. Old photographs were digitized. Clothing was sent for modern forensic testing. The key found in Laura's jacket was re-examined. The tire impressions were compared against archived photographs. And most importantly, investigators located a sealed evidence envelope containing something that had been almost forgotten, a small strip of fabric recovered from the wooded area in 1989. Modern testing revealed a microscopic biological trait. The sample was incomplete. It was not enough to immediately identify a person, but it was enough to establish that someone other than Laura had handled the fabric. Investigators began rebuilding the final hour. The old witness statements were compared with phone records, business receipts, employment logs, and maps. A timeline slowly emerged. Laura had left work shortly after 8. She had apparently stopped at a convenience store. A cashier remembered her buying coffee. Security cameras did not exist in the store then, but the register receipt survived in an old accounting archive. The timestamp placed Laura there at 8:17 p.m. 20 minutes later, a second purchase appeared on the same register. The customer was Thomas Reed. For nearly 3 decades, that detail had been buried in paper. Reed had told police he never saw Laura that night. Now the records suggested otherwise. Investigators found Reed and questioned him again. He was older. His voice was slower. His memory was supposedly worse, but when detectives mentioned the convenience store, his expression changed. He claimed he had forgotten. He said he might have been there but could not remember seeing Laura. When asked about the dark sedan, he said hundreds of cars passed through the area. When asked why his vehicle had been seen near the wooded road, he became defensive. Then detectives asked about the silver key. Reed stared at the table. For the first time in the interview, he stopped speaking. The key had never been identified in 1989. Modern investigators traced it through an old locksmith catalog and discovered that it belonged to a storage facility on the outskirts of Blackridge. The facility had closed years earlier. Its records were nearly destroyed, but one employee remembered that Laura had once rented a small storage unit there. The lock had been changed after her disappearance. Inside the unit, investigators found nothing connected to the murder, but buried inside an old box was a photograph. Laura was standing beside a dark sedan, and behind the wheel was Thomas Reed. The photograph had been taken months before Laura disappeared. It did not prove murder. It proved something far more important. Reed had lied about how well he knew her. For decades, he had insisted their relationship was casual and brief. The photograph suggested otherwise. Investigators discovered letters between them. Some were friendly, others were angry. One contained a sentence that suddenly took on terrifying significance. Laura had written that she was afraid someone was watching her. The investigation accelerated. Detectives reconstructed Reed's movements on the night Laura vanished. His work alibi collapsed under scrutiny. His supervisor admitted Reed had arrived late and had seemed unusually agitated. A former co-worker remembered seeing him washing something from the back of his vehicle before leaving for work. Another witness recalled that Reed had asked whether anyone had reported a woman missing. The evidence was no longer one dramatic clue. It was a chain. And at the center of that chain was a man who had spent 28 years insisting he had nothing to do with Laura Bennett's disappearance. Then came the forensic breakthrough. The biological trace from the fabric was compared against a legally obtained sample associated with Reed. The result was not announced immediately. Investigators waited for confirmation. Then the second laboratory produced the same conclusion. The trace was consistent with Reed. After nearly 3 decades, the cold case had finally cracked. But the most shocking discovery was still buried beneath the silence. Reed had known exactly where Laura's body was. Investigators confronted him one final time. They placed the photograph on the table. They placed the old receipt beside it. They showed him the evidence from the woods. They told him that the forensic results had connected him to Laura's clothing. For several minutes, Reed said nothing. Then he asked one question. "Did you find her?" The room went silent. Detectives knew immediately. They had never told him that Laura's body had not been found. Reed had just revealed what only the killer could have known. After 28 years, the mystery was no longer a question of who had been near Laura. It was a question of what Thomas Reed had done after taking her into the darknet. His arrest sent shockwaves through Blackridge. People who had known him for years struggled to understand how someone could carry a secret for so long. Some remembered him as quiet. Others remembered him as distant. No one remembered him as a murderer. But cold cases do not always end with a dramatic confession. Sometimes they end with one careless sentence, one forgotten receipt, one piece of fabric, one lie that survives for decades until technology finally becomes powerful enough to expose it. Laura Bennett had been missing since 1989. Her name had never truly disappeared. It had waited. And now, after almost 3 decades of silence, the man investigators believed responsible was finally standing behind bars, his carefully constructed story collapsing beneath evidence that had outlived the world he thought he had escaped. But there was still one unbearable question left hanging over Tennessee. Where was Laura? And why had the killer spent 28 years keeping that final secret? The question of where Laura Bennett had been taken became the center of the investigation almost immediately after Thomas Reed's arrest. Detectives had spent years imagining the possibility that her body might never be recovered. Now they knew something different. Reed had revealed knowledge that could only have come from someone connected to the crime, and prosecutors believed the statement would become one of the most important pieces of the case. But knowing that Reed was hiding something was not the same as knowing where Laura was. He had refused to answer. His attorney advised him to remain silent. The courtroom doors opened, cameras appeared outside the courthouse, and a case that had been nearly forgotten suddenly became headline news across Tennessee. A 28-year-old cold case had exploded back into public view. People began searching their memory. Old neighbors called investigators. Former co-workers came forward. People who had been teenagers in 1989 suddenly remembered cars, voices, arguments, strange lights in the woods. One former gas station employee contacted police and claimed he remembered seeing Reed on the night Laura vanished. He said Reed had stopped for fuel shortly after 9 o'clock. The witness remembered the dark sedan because one rear light appeared damaged. Reed had been driving alone, but according to the witness, there had been something unusual in the passenger seat, a blanket. It had been pulled high enough to conceal whatever was underneath. At the time, the employee had thought nothing of it. 28 years later, the memory became disturbed. Detectives returned to the old gas station location. The building had been demolished decades earlier. A convenience store stood there now. The original fuel pumps were gone. The parking lot had been redesigned, but investigators located an archived business ledger showing Reed had indeed purchased gasoline that night. The receipt timestamp placed him there at 9:06 p.m. Laura had disappeared less than an hour earlier. The timeline was tightening. Investigators then revisited the wooded road where Laura's jacket had been found. In 1989, officers had searched the area using flashlights and dogs, but heavy rain had destroyed much of the evidence. The search had focused near the jacket because detectives believed the attack happened there. Modern investigators began questioning that assumption. What if the jacket had been deliberately left there? What if the woods were not the original crime scene? What if Reed had driven somewhere else first? A forensic mapping team reconstructed the tire impressions from the original photographs. The vehicle had entered the woods, stopped briefly, and left again. There were no clear indications that the car had remained there for hours. That meant the location could have been used as a staging point rather than the final destination. The investigation expanded. Detectives examined abandoned properties within a 30-mile radius: farms, barns, quarry roads, vacant houses, old construction sites. Any location that existed in 1989 became a potential target. Reed had worked construction. He knew remote areas. He knew roads most people never used. Then investigators found an old property connected to him. It was a small hunting cabin nearly 12 miles outside Black Ridge. The cabin had belonged to Reed's uncle. According to family records, Reed had access to it in 1989. The property had been sold in the early 1990s and demolished years later. At first, investigators thought the location was a dead end. Then an elderly former neighbor remembered something. 3 days after Laura disappeared, Reed had visited the cabin. He had arrived before sunrise. He had stayed less than an hour, and he had carried 2 heavy containers inside. The neighbor had never reported it because there had been no reason to suspect anything. Reed was known to use the cabin. People moved equipment. People stored tools. In a rural community, unusual behavior could look completely ordinary. But now detectives had a reason to look close. They obtained historical property maps and discovered that the cabin had stood near an old drainage channel that disappeared beneath thick vegetation. The channel had once connected to a creek. Over the decades, the landscape had changed. Trees had grown. Soil had shifted. Roads had been widened, but the investigators believed the ground might still hold evidence. A search team entered the property. Nothing happened for hours. Then a cadaver dog stopped beside a section of earth roughly 20 feet from the former cabin foundation. The dog circled. Then it sat. Investigators marked the location. The excavation began slowly. Every layer of soil was removed by hand. The first discovery was a piece of rusted metal, then a fragment of fabric, then something that looked like a small piece of jewelry. Laura's family had provided photographs showing the jewelry she had worn in 1989. One image showed a small silver pendant around her neck. The fragment found in the soil appeared to match it. The investigation changed again. The ground beneath the old cabin was treated as a potential burial site. Forensic anthropologists arrived, but the excavation did not immediately produce a complete set of remains. Instead, investigators found scattered fragments separated by years of erosion and construction activity. Some had been disturbed by animals, others appeared to have been moved by flooding. Then came the discovery that stunned the team. A small section of bone was recovered from deeper soil. Laboratory testing later confirmed it was human. The age was consistent with Laura. The sex was consistent with Laura. And a subsequent DNA analysis provided the final confirmation. After 28 years, Laura Bennett had been found. The news spread through Blackridge faster than any official statement could contain it. People gathered outside the courthouse. Reporters filled the streets. Laura's photograph appeared again on television screens. Her family, who had spent decades living with uncertainty, finally had an answer. But the answer was devastating. Laura had not left. She had not started a new life. She had not disappeared by choice. She had been killed. Investigators now focused on the final hours of her life. The evidence suggested Laura encountered Reed shortly after leaving work. Whether he approached her voluntarily or forced her into his vehicle remained unclear. Prosecutors believed Reed had convinced her to get into the car because she knew him. That theory explained why there were no obvious signs of a struggle at the convenience store and why witnesses did not report hearing a confrontation. Laura trusted someone she knew. That trust may have been the weapon that killed her. Detectives examined the letters recovered from the storage unit. One of them contained a warning. Laura had told a friend that Reed had become increasingly possessive. She had attempted to distance herself from him. She had told him their relationship was over. Reed apparently disagreed. There was another letter. This one was never sent. It had been found folded inside a book belonging to Laura. The handwriting had been authenticated. The message was short. Laura wrote that she believed someone had been following her. She never named Reed, but she wrote that she was frightened. That single page became one of the most painful pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. Laura had sensed danger. She had tried to create distance, but she had no idea how close the danger already was. The prosecution began assembling its case. DNA evidence connected Reed to the fabric. The photograph established his relationship with Laura. Financial and employment records destroyed parts of his original timeline. Witness testimony placed him near Laura on the night she disappeared. The gas station receipt placed him on the road shortly afterward. The cabin connected him to the location where Laura's remains were ultimately recovered. And then there was his statement. Did you find her? 8 words. 8 words that transformed a decades-old mystery. Reed's defense argued that the statement had been misunderstood. His attorney claimed Reed could have learned information from media reports or investigators during the interrogation, but detectives insisted that the location of the remains had never been publicly disclosed. The question became a battle over memory, evidence, and time. Could a man really carry a secret for 28 years? Could someone commit a murder, hide the body, build a normal life, and wake up every morning knowing that one day the truth might return? The answer appeared to be yes. Reed had married. He had changed jobs. He had moved twice. He had attended family gatherings. He had stood beside friends who believed him innocent. And all the while, Laura Bennett's family had been waiting. The emotional impact of the discovery reached far beyond the courtroom. People who had known Laura as a young woman began bringing flowers to the place where her remains had been recovered. A small memorial appeared near the old cabin property. Candles were placed beneath trees. Someone left a photograph of Laura wearing the same smile her family remembered. For the first time in decades, there was a place to mourn. But there was also anger. Why had the case remained unsolved for so long? Why had Reed's original timeline not been examined more aggressively? Why had investigators dismissed the possibility that the wooded area was only a temporary location? And why had evidence collected in 1989 remained largely untouched until modern technology forced the case open? Those questions became part of the public conversation. The original detectives were no longer able to answer all of them. Some had retired. Others had died. Records were incomplete. Memories had faded. But one retired investigator agreed to speak with the new cold case team. He brought an old cardboard box. Inside were photographs from the original investigation. There was Laura's apartment, her abandoned coffee cup, the broken branches, the jacket beneath the trees, and one photograph of a muddy tire impression. The retired detective stared at it for several seconds. Then he said something that stayed with the investigator. "We were looking in the wrong place." For 28 years, everyone had assumed the woods were where the crime happened. The new investigation showed they may have been where Reed wanted investigators to look. That realization gave the entire case a new meaning. The jacket may not have been discarded in panic. It may have been planted. The tire tracks may not have been evidence of where Laura died. They may have been evidence of where Reed wanted the investigation to end. If that was true, then the killer had manipulated the crime scene from the beginning. He had created confusion. He had relied on rain. He had relied on darkness. He had relied on the limitations of 1989 forensic science. Most importantly, he had relied on time, and for almost 3 decades, time had protected him. But time had also preserved the evidence. The fabric survived. The photograph survived. The receipt survived. The letters survived. The record survived. And Laura's name survived. As investigators prepared for trial, they knew the prosecution had built something that would have been impossible to build in 1989. Not because one miracle clue had appeared, but because dozens of forgotten fragments could finally be connected. The cold case had not been solved by a single discovery. It had been solved by the accumulation of truth, one piece at a time, one lie at a time, one surviving record at a time. And now Thomas Reed faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life answering for what happened on a Tennessee night in 1989. But prosecutors still needed to prove exactly what happened between Laura leaving work and the moment her life ended. There was one final piece of the timeline missing, and buried inside the old evidence was something investigators had overlooked for nearly 3 decades. A recording. Not a confession. Not a police interview. Something much smaller. A voice captured accidentally in the background of a completely unrelated telephone call. The recording had been sitting in an evidence archive since 1989. No one had listened to it in decades. When investigators finally played it again, they heard a sound that changed the direction of the case once more. A car door slammed. A woman's voice spoke a single sentence. And then, in the background, a man's voice answered. The voice was faint, distorted, but investigators believed they knew exactly who it belonged to. The recording had been preserved on a magnetic cassette for nearly 3 decades, sealed inside an evidence box that had been moved from one police facility to another as departments changed, offices closed, and old files were transferred into storage. In 1989, no one had considered the recording important enough to analyze. It had been made during a telephone call involving a local business owner who had contacted police about an unrelated dispute. A patrol officer had activated a small recording device because the caller claimed he was receiving threatening messages. The conversation lasted less than 4 minutes. Most of it had nothing to do with Laura Bennett. For years, the cassette sat untouched. Then the cold case detectives digitized it. At first, they heard nothing useful, static, breathing, a telephone ringing somewhere in the background, the faint hum of an air conditioning unit, the caller speaking rapidly about a business disagreement. Then came the sound that made the forensic technician stop the playback. A vehicle door slammed. The caller continued talking. Another voice appeared in the background. A woman. Her words were almost impossible to understand. The technician isolated the audio, played it again. Then again. The sentence became clearer. "Please, just leave me alone." The room went silent. Investigators knew the voice could not immediately be proven to belong to Laura, but the timing was impossible to ignore. The recording had been made on the same evening Laura disappeared. The location of the telephone call was less than 2 miles from the route Reed was believed to have taken, and the voice had been captured shortly after 9 o'clock. The second voice came only seconds later. Male. Low. Calm. "Get in the car." The detectives listened again. The words were faint, but unmistakable enough to trigger a new forensic comparison. They had Reed's voice from his 2017 interrogation. They had recordings from old interviews. They had archived telephone messages. The voice analysts began comparing speech patterns. They did not claim that a voice alone could prove murder. Too much time had passed. The recording quality was poor. Background noise distorted several syllables, but the analysis identified similarities in rhythm, pronunciation, and vocal characteristics between the unknown male voice and Reed. Then investigators discovered something even more troubling. The telephone call had been recorded at a small insurance office. The office was located directly across the street from the convenience store where Laura had made her final purchase. Suddenly, the timeline became sharp. At 8:17 p.m., Laura entered the store. At approximately 8:30, Reed appeared nearby. At 8:41, witnesses reported seeing a dark sedan. Around 8:50, a woman was heard arguing near the insurance office. At 9:06, Reed purchased gasoline, and shortly afterward, his vehicle was seen heading toward the rural road. The entire sequence could fit together, but detectives needed more than a plausible story. They needed proof. They returned to the surviving evidence. Laura's jacket was examined again. Modern microscopy identified several fibers that had not been documented in the original report. Most were common. One was unusual, a synthetic upholstery fiber consistent with the interior fabric of an older vehicle. Investigators compared the fiber to photographs of Reed's sedan. The upholstery pattern appeared similar. That still was not enough. Then they found the original repair invoice from the mechanic who had fixed Reed's rear light before the disappearance. The invoice contained a handwritten note. Interior cleaned. The note had been added by the mechanic after Reed asked him to vacuum the car. In 1989, nobody had considered that suspicious. Now it looked different. Why would a man suddenly insist on having the interior of his vehicle cleaned immediately before a woman disappeared? The mechanic was interviewed again. His memory was incomplete, but one detail returned. Reed had been unusually concerned about the back seat. He had told the mechanic that someone had spilled something there. The mechanic remembered seeing a dark stain beneath the rear floor mat. He had assumed it was oil. Investigators searched for the old floor mat. It was gone, but the mechanic had retained something else, a small piece of fabric he had removed from beneath the mat during the repair. He had thrown it into a box of miscellaneous automotive scrap. That box had remained in his garage for decades. Investigators retrieved it. The fabric was tested. There was no usable DNA, but the weave was consistent with the same type of material found on Laura's clothing. The case was becoming harder to dismiss as coincidence. Reed's defense team pushed back immediately. They argued that Laura and Reed had known each other. Any trace of Reed inside his vehicle or on Laura's clothing could have come from ordinary contact. They questioned the reliability of witnesses whose memories had been reconstructed after decades. They challenged the voice analysis. They pointed out that the biological evidence was incomplete. The defense had one advantage. There was still no eyewitness who had seen Reed kill Laura. There was no murder weapon. There was no complete forensic record from the original scene. And there was no confession. The prosecution needed to build a case from circumstances. But circumstances can become powerful when they form a single direction. Investigators discovered that Reed had made one phone call the morning after Laura disappeared. The number belonged to a former co-worker. The co-worker had died years earlier, but his family still possessed old telephone records and personal notes. One handwritten entry read, Tom asked if police had found anything near the old quarry. The old quarry. Detectives had never considered it central to the case. They searched historical maps. The quarry was less than 4 miles from the cabin. More importantly, it had been abandoned in 1989. The location was isolated. There were deep pits, water-filled depressions, collapsed access roads, and almost no reason for anyone to be there at night. Investigators brought search dogs. The first search produced nothing. The second search produced nothing. Then, near the edge of a drainage ditch, a dog reacted strongly to a patch of soil beneath several inches of gravel. The ground was excavated. A rusted metal object appeared. It was part of a vehicle jack. No identification. No fingerprints. Nothing that directly connected Reed. The team continued. Several feet away, they found fragments of an old plastic storage container. Inside was a piece of cloth. The material was degraded, but its color remained faintly visible. Blue! Laura had been wearing a blue sweater on the night she disappeared. The fragment was sent for testing. It was not large enough to establish a complete match, but the fibers contained traces of a chemical compound consistent with an industrial cleaning product. Investigators looked at Reed's employment history. In 1989, he worked for a construction company that regularly used the same chemical. The connection was indirect. Still, the pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. Then came the breakthrough that investigators had been waiting for. A former construction worker named Michael Harlan contacted the cold case unit. Harlan had been 17 in 1989. He had worked temporary jobs with Reed during the summer. He told detectives that the night after Laura disappeared, Reed had asked him to help move something from the cabin. Harlan had forgotten about the request until he saw the recent news coverage. He remembered Reed arriving before dawn. He remembered 2 containers, and he remembered one sentence. Reed had told him, "Don't look inside." Harlan never asked what was inside. He never reported it. He said he had assumed Reed was hiding stolen tools or construction material. But Harlan remembered another detail. One of the containers was heavy, far too heavy for what Reed claimed it contained. Investigators asked Harlan why he had waited nearly 30 years to speak. His answer was simple. He had been afraid of being wrong. He had spent decades wondering whether his memory was accurate. But when he saw the photograph of Laura on television, something came back. The same blue sweater, the same night, the same cabin, the same man. Harlan agreed to take investigators to the location where the containers had supposedly been stored. The cabin was gone. The property had been cleared, but the drainage channel remained. And that was where the forensic team eventually recovered the first human remains. The discovery gave new meaning to Harlan's memory. Investigators now believed Reed may have used the cabin and surrounding property to conceal Laura after the killing. But there was another possibility. Reed may have moved her more than once. The quarry, the cabin, the wooded road. 3 separate locations. 3 places where evidence had surfaced. The question became whether Reed had intentionally created multiple false trails. If he had, the murder was not simply a violent act. It was an organized attempt to control the investigation. That theory gained strength when detectives examined Reed's behavior after Laura disappeared. He had contacted several people. He had asked whether police were searching specific areas. He had followed newspaper reports. He had even attended one of the volunteer searches. That detail had never seemed remarkable in 1989. Now it was chilling. The man investigators believed had killed Laura had apparently walked alongside volunteers while they searched for her. He had listened to people calling her name. He had watched her family search the wood, and he had known she was already dead. The emotional weight of that realization was enormous. Laura's mother had spent years believing that someone might still know where her daughter was. She had joined searches. She had distributed photographs. She had answered phone calls from strangers claiming to have seen Laura. And all the while, the person investigators now believed responsible had remained nearby. The case had become more than a murder investigation. It had become a study in deception. The prosecution began preparing a detailed timeline for trial. But one issue remained. Why had Reed killed Laura? Investigators believed the motive was connected to rejection, obsession, and control. Laura had tried to end their relationship. She had told friends she felt uncomfortable. She had attempted to distance herself. Reed had not accepted it. The letters suggested escalating tension, but prosecutors knew motive alone would not convict him. They needed to reconstruct the final confrontation. The voice recording offered one possible answer. Laura's word, "Please, just leave me alone." Then Reed's response, "Get in the car." If the voice belonged to them, it placed both individuals together immediately before the disappearance. The recording was imperfect, but it had survived. Just like the receipt, just like the fabric, just like the photograph, just like Laura's name. The investigation had begun with almost nothing. Now it contained a timeline, physical evidence, witness testimony, forensic connections, and a suspect whose own words appeared to place him closer to the crime than he had ever admitted. Still, one question remained unanswered. What happened inside Reed's vehicle after Laura got in? And why did investigators believe the final confrontation may have begun long before that night? Buried among the old letters was a message Laura had written weeks before she vanished. She had described a moment when Reed became angry after she refused to see him. She wrote that he had looked at her and said something she could not forget, a sentence that seemed insignificant at the time, but after 28 years, it sounded like a warning. "If I can't have you," Reed had allegedly told her, "nobody will." The sentence was never reported to police in 1989. It existed only in Laura's private writing. And now, sitting in the evidence room decades later, it became one of the most disturbing pieces of the entire case, because if the words were genuine, then Laura had seen the danger coming. She had written it down. She had tried to protect herself. And still, on that Tennessee night in 1989, she disappeared. The cold case was no longer cold, but investigators were beginning to realize that solving the murder and proving it in court were two very different battles. The final fight would not take place in the wood. It would take place beneath courtroom lights, where every forgotten clue would be challenged, every witness questioned, and every surviving fragment forced to answer the same brutal question. Was Thomas Reed truly the man who had taken Laura Bennett's life? Or had investigators spent decades building a case around a man who simply happened to be standing closest to the mystery? The answer would depend on one piece of evidence, and that evidence had been sitting in a laboratory freezer for 28 years. The evidence in the freezer was a small plastic tube with a faded handwritten label. There was no dramatic photograph attached to it, no confession, no blood-soaked weapon, just a sample collected from Laura Bennett's clothing during the original investigation and preserved because a technician in 1989 had decided not to discard it. For decades, nobody knew whether it would ever matter. Technology had changed. Laboratories had changed. The case had changed. But the sample had remained exactly where it was, waiting for a question that could not have been asked in 1989. Now investigators had that question. Could the biological material inside the tube identify the person who had been in contact with Laura during the final hours of her life? The first test produced a partial profile. Not enough. The second test produced a stronger result. Still not enough. The laboratory tried again using newer amplification techniques. The sample was tiny. Contamination was a constant concern. Every step had to be documented. Every result had to be independently verified. Then the technician called the lead detector. The profile was consistent with Thomas Reed. The detective asked for confirmation. The laboratory repeated the analysis. The same conclusion emerged. For the first time, investigators possessed a forensic connection that could place Reed directly against Laura's clothing. It did not explain the entire crime. It did not tell them exactly when the contact occurred, but combined with everything else, it transformed the case. Reed's defense immediately attacked the evidence. His attorneys argued that Reed had known Laura and could have touched her clothing before the night she disappeared. They questioned the age of the sample. They questioned the possibility of contamination. They argued that a partial profile could not establish the circumstances of contact. The prosecution knew the argument was serious. A cold case built on old evidence could collapse if even one major piece became unreliable. So investigators went backward. They examined every person who had handled Laura's clothing in 1989. Police officers, crime scene technicians, evidence clerks, laboratory workers, medical personnel. They compared available records and eliminated potential sources. The chain of custody had survived. The sample had remained sealed. The result was not a miracle. It was evidence that had simply been waiting for technology to catch up. But investigators still needed to establish when Reed had contact with Laura. The answer came from the old letter. One letter contained a description of a blue coat Laura had recently purchased. She mentioned that Reed had grabbed the sleeve during an argument. That meant his biological material could have been transferred before the night of the disappearance. The defense seized on the point. The prosecution countered with the location of the sample. It had not been recovered from the outside of the coat. It had been found near the torn section of fabric associated with the struggle in the wood. That distinction mattered. The original forensic report had described the material as being concentrated around the damaged area. Investigators now believed Laura may have been grabbed there, but there was still uncertainty. The case had accumulated so many years of missing information that every answer seemed to produce another question. Then the voice analysis returned. The laboratory had cleaned the old recording as much as possible without altering the underlying audio spectral analysis, separated background noise from speech. The male voice was still faint, but experts identified several characteristics that were statistically consistent with Reed. The defense argued that the recording was too degraded. The prosecution argued that it did not stand alone. It was another piece, and the pieces were beginning to form a shape. A man Laura knew. A man who had been rejected by her, a man who lied about seeing her, a man whose vehicle appeared in the timeline, a man whose biological material was recovered from damaged clothing, a man who knew where investigators had searched, a man who accidentally revealed knowledge about Laura's remains, a man who had access to an isolated cabin, a man whose movements on the night of the disappearance had never been fully explained. The evidence was no longer scattered. It was converging. Meanwhile, the town of Blackridge was experiencing a strange kind of awakening. People began talking about the case again. Old newspaper clippings appeared on social media. Former volunteers remembered the search party. People who had been children in 1989 described how Laura's disappearance had changed the community. One woman remembered her mother locking the doors every night after the news broke. Another remembered carrying flyers through neighborhoods. A former classmate remembered Laura's laugh. Someone else remembered seeing her at the diner. These memories did not prove anything, but they reminded investigators of something the case files could never fully capture. Laura had not been a cold case number. She had been a person. She had plans. She had friends. She had a family waiting for her. She had been 22 years old, and on the night she disappeared, she believed she was going home. That human reality became especially important as the trial approached. The prosecution did not want Laura reduced to forensic evidence. They wanted the jury to understand who she had been and why her disappearance had devastated the people around her. But the defense had its own strategy. They intended to portray Reed as a suspicious man trapped inside a chain of coincidences. They argued that he had known Laura, that he had driven near the wooded road, that he had visited the cabin, yes, that he had possessed an old vehicle similar to the one described by witnesses, but none of those facts, they argued, proved murder. They emphasized the absence of a weapon. They emphasized the absence of a complete eyewitness account. They emphasized the uncertainty surrounding the voice recorded. And they attacked the prosecution's timeline. 28 years had passed. People forget. Records disappear. Witnesses die. Landscapes change. Memories become stories. The defense wanted the jury to believe the case had become too old to reconstruct accurately. Then prosecutors produced the gas station receipt. The timestamp was original. The paper had been preserved in an archived business ledger. It had not been created decades later. It showed Reed's vehicle had stopped for gasoline less than an hour after Laura's final confirmed sighting. The prosecution placed a map on the courtroom wall. The convenience store, the insurance office, the wooded road, the quarry, the cabin, the route between them. The distances were short. The timeline was possible. The defense had no explanation for why Reed had lied about his movement. That became one of the central questions. If Reed was innocent, why had he changed his story? Why did he first claim he went directly home? Why did he later admit stopping for gas? Why had he denied seeing Laura? Why had he asked about police searches near the quarry? Why had he known that investigators had not found Laura's remains? And why, when confronted years later, had he asked investigators if they had found her? That final question became devastating. During the interrogation, detectives had never mentioned the cabin. They had never described the burial location. They had never told Reed that human remains had been recovered. Yet Reed had reacted as though he already understood exactly what the detectives were talking about. The prosecution replayed the interrogation. The courtroom listened. There was no dramatic confession, no shouting, no sudden breakdown, just a long silence. Then Reed's voice. "Did you find her?" The jury heard it again and again. The defense tried to explain it. Maybe Reed misunderstood. Maybe he assumed detectives were referring to Laura's body. Maybe the question was prompted by news report. But the prosecution pointed out that no public report had identified the location where Laura's remains were eventually discovered. The knowledge had been inside the investigation, and now it appeared to be inside Reed. The case seemed stronger. But investigators discovered one final complication. A second DNA profile had been found on another piece of Laura's clothing. It did not belong to Reed. For several days, detectives wondered whether they had been wrong. Had another man been involved? Was Reed an accomplice? Was there another killer? The discovery reopened the entire investigation. The unknown profile was entered into available databases. No match appeared. Investigators searched old records. Nothing. They tested relatives. Nothing. They examined the possibility of contamination. The profile remained unexplained. For a moment, the entire case seemed to fracture. Then a forensic specialist noticed something. The second profile was located on the inside of Laura's jacket, not near the damaged area, not near the blood, not near the torn sleeve. Inside, the material was consistent with a common transfer from a person who had handled the garment months or even years earlier. The profile could have belonged to someone who had touched the jacket before Laura ever disappeared. It was not evidence of a second killer. The mystery narrowed again. Reed remained the central suspect. But there was still one problem. The prosecution needed to establish what happened after Laura entered the vehicle. That missing hour was the heart of the case. Investigators reconstructed the route using the old road network. Reed could have driven from the convenience store toward the wooded road. From there, he could have reached the quarry, then the cabin. The timing fit. But the motive for stopping at each location remained uncertain. Then a retired highway worker came forward. He had maintained the rural road in 1989. He remembered seeing a dark sedan parked near an abandoned access road on the night Laura disappeared. He had not reported it because he assumed someone was hunted, but he remembered the driver. The man had been standing beside the open trunk, and there had been something on the ground, a blue object. The witness could not say what it was. He could not identify Reed with absolute certainty. But when investigators showed him an old photograph, he pointed toward Reed. That looks like him. The witness statement was not perfect, but once again, the timeline tightened. A dark sedan, an open trunk, a blue object, a rural road, and a man who claimed he had never been there. The prosecution now believed they could reconstruct the final sequence with enough certainty to tell the jury what they believed happened. Laura had left work. She encountered Reed. An argument followed. She resisted him. She was forced into the vehicle. The car moved toward the rural road. At some point, Laura's jacket was damaged. Reed attempted to create a false trail near the wooded road. He later moved Laura to the cabin property, and eventually he concealed her remains. The theory was horrifying, but investigators still did not know exactly where Laura died. That distinction mattered. The prosecution could prove murder without proving every minute, but the defense would attack every uncertainty. And as the trial date approached, Reed remained silent. He sat in court with the same expression he had carried through the investigation. No confession, no explanation, no apology. Outside, Laura's family waited. 28 years of waiting had brought them to a courtroom, but they still did not know whether they would hear the truth, because the man accused of killing Laura had one final weapon: silence. And if the evidence failed to speak loudly enough, the killer might walk away from the courtroom just as he had walked away from the woods in 1989. The difference was that this time, the investigators were ready. They had Laura's voice. They had Reed's voice. They had the receipt, the photograph, the fabric, the cabin, the remains, and the sentence that had survived nearly 3 decades. If I can't have you, nobody will. The trial was about to begin, and every piece of the Tennessee cold case was about to be placed under the harshest light possible. The courtroom doors opened just after 8 in the morning, and by the time the first jurors entered, every seat behind the prosecution table was occupied. Reporters filled the back rows. Cameras waited outside. Laura Bennett's family sat together, almost motionless. 28 years had passed since they had last known where Laura was. Now they were sitting only a few feet from the man accused of taking her life. Thomas Reed entered without looking at them. He wore a dark suit. His hair had turned gray. His face looked older than the photographs from 1989. To someone who knew nothing about the case, he looked like an ordinary man approaching an ordinary courtroom. But the prosecution did not see an ordinary defendant. They saw the man who had spent decades carrying a secret. The prosecutor stood before the jury and began with a photograph. Laura, 22 years old, smiling, alive. The courtroom became silent. The prosecutor did not begin with the DNA. He did not begin with the recovered remains. He did not begin with the interrogation. He began with the woman. She was not a mystery, he said. She was a daughter, a friend, a young woman with a future. And on one night in 1989, that future was taken from her. The defense objected to the emotional tone. The judge allowed the statement to stand. Then the prosecutor placed a second photograph on the screen, Laura's abandoned jacket. The image was taken beneath the trees nearly 3 miles from town. The torn sleeve was visible. The courtroom stared at it. The prosecutor explained that this photograph had been taken before anyone knew where Laura was, before the case became national news, before technology could recover microscopic biological evidence, before investigators understood how important the jacket would eventually become. In 1989, the photograph had been one more piece of evidence. In 2017, it became something different. It became the beginning of the end. The first witness was the mechanic. Daniel Mercer walked slowly toward the stand. He was older now. His hands shook slightly as he raised them to take the oath. The prosecutor asked him whether he remembered Thomas Reed. Mercer said yes. He remembered the dark sedan. He remembered the damaged rear light. He remembered Reed arriving shortly before Laura disappeared. And he remembered something else. He wanted the inside cleaned, Mercer said. The prosecutor asked why. Mercer looked toward Reed. He said something had spilled. What did you think had spilled? Oil. Did you see anything unusual? Mercer paused. The back seat had been disturbed. The defense attorney stood. Mr. Mercer, is it fair to say you did not report any of this in 1989? Yes. You did not believe it was important? No. You are remembering this nearly 30 years later? Yes. And memory can change? Yes. So you cannot tell this jury that Mr. Reed killed Laura Bennett. Mercer looked directly at the defense attorney. No, I can't. The defense smiled briefly. The prosecutor did not react. He knew the case would not be won by one witness. It would be won by the pattern. The next witness was the convenience store cashier. She had been 24 in 1989. Now she was in her 50s. She remembered Laura. She remembered the coffee. She remembered the time. And she remembered Reed. The original receipt was displayed on a monitor. 8:17 p.m. Laura Bennett. Then another receipt. 9:06 p.m. Thomas Reed. The defense tried to argue that the store was busy and that the cashier could not possibly remember every customer from nearly 3 decades earlier. The witness admitted that. But she had something the defense could not erase. The receipt. The records confirmed what her memory could not. Laura was there. Reed was there. Less than an hour separated their appearances. Then investigators reconstructed the route. The prosecutor displayed an old road map. The convenience store was marked in red. The insurance office was marked in another color. The wooded road. The quarry. The cabin. 5 locations. One night. The prosecutor traced the route with his finger. Reed's vehicle could have traveled between every location within the available time. The defense argued that could have was not proof. The judge agreed. The jury was instructed to consider the evidence carefully. Then came the recording. The courtroom lights dimmed. A technician placed the old audio on the screen. The recording began with static. A man's voice spoke in the background. Then the sound of a car door. A woman spoke. The words were barely audible. The forensic enhancement brought them forward. Please, just leave me alone. Someone in the courtroom inhaled sharply. The recording continued. Then the male voice. Get in the car. Laura's mother closed her eyes. The prosecution stopped the record. The defense immediately challenged it. The attorney argued that the audio quality was too poor to identify either speaker. He told the jury they could not assume the woman was Laura. He told them they could not assume the man was Reed. The judge allowed the recording but warned the jury about its limitations. Then the prosecution introduced the voice expert. The expert explained that voices are not identified by one sound alone. Analysts examine patterns, rhythm, frequency, pronunciation, certain speech characteristics. The expert had compared the unknown male voice with recordings of Reed. The results were consistent. Not absolute, not perfect, but significant. The defense attacked the methodology. The expert remained calm. He admitted that the recording could not establish identity with mathematical certainty, but he explained that the similarity was strong enough to warrant consideration alongside the other evidence. Again, the prosecution did not need one perfect clue. They needed the jury to see the entire structure. Then came the forensic specialist. The biological sample recovered from Laura's clothing was explained. The laboratory had recovered a partial DNA profile. It was consistent with Reed. The defense immediately challenged the age of the sample. The specialist explained how the evidence had been preserved. The sample had been sealed in 1989. It had remained in controlled storage. Modern testing had allowed investigators to extract information that older technology could not. The defense asked whether the DNA proved Reed killed Laura. No, specialist said. Then it proves nothing. The prosecutor objected. The judge sustained. The specialist continued. The DNA could not establish the exact moment of contact, but it established that Reed's biological material was present on a piece of clothing associated with Laura's disappearance. The location of the material mattered. It had been found near the torn section of the jacket, the same section investigators believed had been involved in a struggle. The defense attorney returned to the old relationship. You agree Mr. Reed knew Laura? Yes. You agree they had physical contact before 1989? Yes. So his DNA could have been transferred earlier? It could have. The defense turned toward the juror. For the first time, the prosecution's case seemed vulnerable. But then the prosecutor stood. He asked one question. Would earlier contact explain the presence of the biological material near the damaged section of the jacket? The specialist answered, not by itself. The courtroom became quiet again. The evidence was beginning to move beyond coincidence. Then the prosecution called the retired detective. He walked into the courtroom carrying a cardboard evidence box. It was the same box he had preserved from the original investigation. Inside were photographs, notes, map, the original search records. He placed them on the witness stand. The prosecutor asked him whether investigators in 1989 had considered Reed a person of interest. Yes. Did he provide an alibi? Yes. Was that alibi verified? Partially. The detective explained the time card discrepancy. Reed had claimed to be at work earlier than the records showed. The defense argued that people make mistakes. The detective agreed. Then the prosecutor asked another question. Did Mr. Reed ever provide a consistent explanation for the hours before work? No. That answer landed harder than the other, because the prosecution was building the case around Reed's own contradiction. His story changed. His movements changed. His explanation changed. But the evidence remained. The detective then described the wooded road. He explained how the original team had focused on the area where Laura's jacket was discovered. The prosecutor asked whether they had considered the possibility that the jacket had been deliberately placed there. The detective looked down. Not enough. Why? We believed we were looking at the primary scene. And were you? The detective hesitated. No. That single answer exposed one of the central failures of the original investigation. The case had not lacked clues. It had lacked the technology and perspective needed to understand them. The defense seized on the admission. So the original investigation made mistakes? Yes. Evidence was missed? Yes. Witnesses were not fully followed up? Yes. Records were lost? Yes. The defense attorney turned toward the juror. This case is built on a mistake. The prosecutor waited. Then he called the next witness. Michael Harlan, the former construction worker, the teenager who had seen Reed at the cabin. Harlan entered quietly. He looked uncomfortable. He admitted he had never reported what he remembered. He admitted that nearly 30 years had passed. He admitted that some details were uncertain. The defense questioned him aggressively. Did you actually see a body? No. Did you see Laura Bennett? No. Did you see Mr. Reed bury anyone? No. So you have no evidence that what you saw had anything to do with Laura Bennett. Harlan looked at the prosecutor, then back at the defense. No direct evidence. The defense attorney smiled, but Harlan continued. I remember the containers. The smile disappeared. I remember how heavy they were. And I remember Mr. Reed telling me not to look inside. The prosecutor asked him whether he could identify the location. Harlan nodded. Investigators later confirmed that the location was near the same property where Laura's remains were eventually discovered. That connection changed the atmosphere inside the courtroom. The defense had successfully shown that many witnesses were uncertain, but uncertainty was no longer working entirely in their favor. The witnesses did not need to remember every detail. They only needed to establish pieces of the timeline, and the pieces were aligning. Then prosecutors revealed the most damaging evidence of all, the interrogation. The courtroom watched Thomas Reed sit at a table in 2017, older, tired, defensive. The detective asked him whether he knew where Laura was. Reed denied it. The detective asked whether he had ever been near the cabin. Reed denied it. The detective asked whether he had seen Laura on the night she disappeared. Reed said no. Then the detective mentioned the recovered evidence. Reed leaned forward. His face changed. And then he asked the question that had haunted investigators ever since. Did you find her? The recording stopped. Nobody moved. The prosecutor turned toward the juror. They knew the defense would fight that sentence. They knew it could be interpreted in different ways. But they also knew something else. At the time Reed said it, investigators had not publicly disclosed the location where Laura's remains had been recovered. The information had been restricted, and Reed had somehow reacted as if he already knew. The courtroom lights came back on. Laura's mother was crying silently. Reed stared straight ahead. For the first time since the trial began, he looked uneasy. The prosecution had not produced a confession. They had produced something more complicated. A trail of evidence that had survived 28 years. A trail built from old paper, old fabric, old memories, old recordings, and modern science. But there was still one question the jury had not heard answered. What happened to Laura after she got into Reed's car? The prosecution believed the answer was hidden inside one final document, a handwritten page. Laura's own words, a page that had never been shown to police in 1989, a page that had been hidden inside a book for decades. And when the prosecutor placed it on the evidence screen, the courtroom saw the sentence Laura had written only weeks before she disappeared. If something happens to me, I don't think it will be an accident. The room went completely silent. For 28 years, that sentence had waited for someone to read it. Now the jury was listening, and the man accused of killing her was sitting only a few feet away. The sentence remained on the screen for several seconds, black letters against a white background, written in Laura Bennett's own handwriting decades before anyone knew how the story would end. If something happens to me, I don't think it will be an accident. The prosecutor did not need to explain why the sentence mattered. The jury could see it. Laura had been afraid. She had documented that fear. And now the man she had feared was sitting in the same courtroom, listening to her words being read aloud. But the defense was ready. The attorney rose slowly and reminded the jury of something the prosecution could not escape. The page did not name Thomas Reed. It did not describe a murder. It did not identify a date. It did not predict what would happen. It was a warning, not a confession. The defense argued that Laura had known other people. She had experienced ordinary conflicts. She had been young. She had been frightened by circumstances that might have had nothing to do with Reed. The prosecutor accepted the limitation. Then he asked the jury to consider something else. Why had Laura written it? Why had she kept the page? And why did so many pieces of the investigation now point toward the same man? The trial moved into its most intense phase. Forensic experts reconstructed the scene around the jacket. They showed photographs taken in 1989 and compared them with the landscape as it appeared decades later. The wooded road had changed dramatically. Trees had grown. The ground had shifted. New vegetation covered sections that had once been open. But the original photographs preserved details that no longer existed. A narrow tire path, broken branches, a disturbed section of earth, a footprint partially preserved in mud. Investigators enhanced the photographs digitally and discovered something the original team had not recognized. The tire tracks appeared to enter the wooded area, stop near where Laura's jacket was found, and then turn around. There was no evidence of a vehicle traveling deeper into the wood. That meant the jacket may have been placed there deliberately. The prosecutor explained the theory. If Reed wanted investigators to believe Laura had been attacked in the woods, leaving her jacket there would make the area appear to be the primary crime scene. But if Laura had already been inside his vehicle, the jacket could have been removed during a struggle and discarded later. The defense objected. The judge allowed the testimony as a theory rather than a proven fact. Still, the implication was clear. The original crime scene might never have been where investigators thought. Then the prosecution introduced the photograph from the storage unit. Laura standing beside the dark sedan, Reed behind the wheel. The defense argued that the photograph showed nothing more than two people who knew each other. The prosecutor agreed. Then another photograph appeared. Laura and Reed again. This time closer. Reed's arm was around her. Laura was smiling, but investigators could not determine whether the image reflected genuine affection or an ordinary moment between friends. The prosecutor did not claim it proved murder. He used it to establish something else. Reed had access to Laura. He knew her routines. He knew where she worked. He knew the roads she traveled. He knew the people around her. He knew when she was alone. That mattered, because the prosecution's theory depended on one crucial fact. Laura had not been abducted by a stranger. She had likely entered the vehicle of someone she recognized. That explained the absence of a public struggle. It explained why no one remembered hearing screams at the convenience store. It explained why the final confrontation could have happened without attracting attention. And it explained why Reed had been able to get close enough to her in the first place. The defense tried another strategy. They introduced an alternate suspect. A man named Gary Lawson had lived near the wooded road in 1989. He had a history of violent behavior and had been questioned during the original investigation. He had moved out of Tennessee shortly afterward. The defense suggested that investigators had ignored Lawson, but the prosecution had anticipated the argument. They produced his alibi. Lawson had been working a night shift at a factory nearly 40 miles away. His employer records were intact. His supervisor had remembered him. The time card was verified. The defense could not explain it. The alternate suspect disappeared from the case as quickly as he had appeared. Then another name surfaced. A former boyfriend. He had argued with Laura several weeks before her disappearance, but he had left town days early. His phone records and employment records placed him elsewhere. Again, the defense had created possibilities. But possibilities were not evidence. The prosecution returned to Reed. They showed the jury the timeline. 8:17 p.m. Laura at the convenience store. 8:30. Reed nearby. 8:41. Dark sedan. 8:50. The argument heard near the insurance office. 9:06. Reed buys gasoline. Later, the vehicle appears near the rural road. Then the cabin. Then the silence. The defense argued that the timeline was reconstructed decades later. The prosecutor responded that several entries were based on records created in 1989. The timestamps had existed long before the investigation was reopened. They had simply not been connected. That became one of the defining themes of the trial. The evidence had always been there. People had failed to see what it meant. The jury heard from an archival specialist who explained how the old business records had been preserved. Receipts, ledgers, telephone logs, employment documents. They had survived because nobody had considered them important enough to destroy. The prosecutor called them the paper trail of a murder. The phrase appeared in headlines that night. Outside the courthouse, reporters repeated it. Inside, the jury listened. Then came the cabin evidence. The forensic anthropologist explained where Laura's remains had been discovered. The location was shown on a large diagram. The burial area was close to the former cabin foundation. The remains had been disturbed over time, but several pieces of evidence connected the location to Laura. Her DNA, the pendant fragment, the position of the remains, the surrounding soil. The defense asked whether the remains could have been placed there by someone other than Reed. The anthropologist said it was theoretically possible. The defense pressed harder. So you cannot tell this jury who buried her? No, you cannot tell them when she was buried, not with exact precision. You cannot tell them who killed her. That is not my role. The defense sat down. The prosecutor stood. He did not challenge the expert. Instead, he asked one question. Were the remains consistent with the location described by the witness who said Mr. Reed brought heavy containers to the cabin? The expert answered, yes, that was enough. The next witness was a former property owner. He had purchased the land years after Laura disappeared. He testified that Reed had returned to the property several times after the sale. The defense objected. The prosecutor asked why. The witness said Reed had asked to retrieve tools. That was ordinary. But on one visit, the witness noticed Reed walking toward the drainage area. He had seemed nervous. The witness asked what he was doing. Reed reportedly said he was looking for something he had lost. The defense challenged the memory. The witness admitted it had been decades ago, but the property records confirmed that Reed had permission to visit. Again, the prosecution did not need to prove every movement. They needed to establish opportunity, and Reed had it. Then came the most emotional testimony of the trial. Laura's mother took the stand. She carried a photograph of her daughter. The courtroom was silent before she spoke. She described Laura as a child. She described her first job, her first apartment, the way she used to call home, the things she had planned. She described the night Laura disappeared, the phone that never rang, the bedroom that remained untouched, the weeks of searching, the years of waiting, the strangers who called claiming to know where Laura was, the false sightings, the birthdays, the holidays, the empty chair. She stopped several times. The prosecutor asked whether she had ever believed Laura would come home. Yes, she said. For years, she said, she believed there was a chance, even after the years became decades. Then she looked toward Reed. I needed to know where my daughter was. The courtroom became still. I needed to know what happened. She did not shout. She did not accuse him. She simply said that she wanted the truth. The defense did not cross-examine her aggressively. There was little they could gain. Her testimony was not evidence of who killed Laura. It was evidence of what the disappearance had done to the family. When she left the witness stand, Laura's photograph remained on the screen. For a moment, the trial stopped being about forensic profiles and timeline. It became about a daughter who never came home. Then the prosecution introduced another document, a letter written by Reed. It had been discovered among old personal belongings after his arrest. The letter was not addressed to Laura. It was written to himself. A private note. A fragment of thought. The defense tried to block it. The judge allowed a limited portion. One sentence was read aloud. I thought the woods would be enough. Nobody moved. The defense argued that the phrase was meaningless without context. Maybe Reed was referring to something unrelated. Maybe he had written it about a different event. But investigators had recovered the note from a box containing materials connected to the 1989 period. The prosecutor connected it to the evidence, the woods, Laura's jacket, the false trail, the tire marks. Suddenly, the theory of deliberate staging became much stronger. Reed may have believed that leaving evidence in the woods would create enough confusion to mislead investigators. For 28 years it had worked. Then technology caught up. The defense still had one final argument. They claimed the prosecution had built a story around a man who looked suspicious because he had been investigated from the beginning. They warned the jury about confirmation bias. They said once investigators decided Reed was the killer, every piece of evidence began to look like proof. The prosecutor did not deny that danger. Instead, he told the jury to ignore what detectives believed and examine what the evidence actually showed. Laura disappeared. Reed lied about his movements. His vehicle appeared in the timeline. His biological material was found on her damaged clothing. A recording placed voices resembling Laura and Reed together near the time she vanished. A witness placed Reed near the cabin. Laura's remains were found there. Reed later demonstrated knowledge of information investigators had not publicly disclosed, and a handwritten note appeared to reference the wood. The prosecutor paused. Coincidences can happen, he said, but eventually the number of coincidences becomes its own answer. The defense objected. The judge allowed the statement. The trial moved toward closing arguments. Outside, television crews waited. Inside, the jury prepared to hear the final summary. Reed remained expressionless, but Laura's family had changed. For the first time, they had heard the evidence laid out in one plate. The scattered fragments of 28 years had finally become one story, a story of fear, obsession, deception, and a young woman whose final hours had been hidden beneath decades of silence. The prosecutor turned toward the jury. He held up the photograph of Laura. Then he held up the evidence box. Two worlds. One showed who she was. The other showed what remained after she was gone. He asked the jury to decide whether the man sitting across the room was responsible. The defense stood next, and for the first time they offered their complete theory. They said the investigation was built on assumptions. They said the forensic evidence was incomplete. They said the voice was uncertain. They said the witnesses were unreliable. They said the records proved Reed had been nearby, but being nearby was not murder. And then they delivered their final sentence. Suspicion is not proof. The prosecutor rose again. He looked at the jury, then at Reed, then at Laura's family. No, he said, suspicion is not proof, but this case is no longer based on suspicion. He pointed toward the evidence. It is based on what survived. The jury left the courtroom. The doors closed behind them. Laura's family remained seated. Reed looked straight ahead. For the first time in 28 years, the fate of the man accused of killing Laura Bennett was no longer controlled by missing evidence, forgotten records, or unanswered questions. It was in the hands of 12 strangers, and somewhere inside that jury room was the answer Blackridge had been waiting for since 1989. Guilty or not guilty? The cold case had finally reached its last question, and the silence that followed was almost unbearable. The jury room door closed, and the courtroom suddenly felt larger than it had before. For nearly 3 decades, Laura Bennett's disappearance had lived inside files, photographs, rumors, and memory. Now 12 people held the decision that would determine whether Thomas Reed would be held responsible for her death. There would be no more witnesses, no more forensic tests, no more hidden documents brought out at the last second. The evidence had been presented. The arguments were finished. All that remained was judgment. Inside the jury room, the jurors began with the timeline. One juror placed the convenience store receipt on the table. 8:17 p.m. Another placed the gasoline receipt beside it. 9:06 p.m. Someone unfolded the map showing the route from town to the wooded road. Another juror mentioned the recorder. Get in the car. The words had stayed with everyone. Then came the question that divided the room. Could the jury trust evidence collected 28 years earlier? One juror believed the answer was yes. Another was uncertain. The defense had successfully exposed weaknesses in the original investigation. The crime scene had not been handled perfectly. Some witnesses had forgotten details. The voice recording was degraded. The DNA profile was partial. The handwritten note was ambiguous. But there was something difficult to ignore. Reed had lied. Not once. Repeatedly. He had lied about knowing Laura well. He had lied about seeing her. He had lied about where he had been before work. And when investigators eventually found Laura's remains, he had reacted as if he already knew where she was. The jurors returned to that statement. Did you find her? One juror argued that the sentence could have been a guess. Another asked how Reed could possibly know what investigators had not disclosed. The room became quiet. Then a third juror said something simple. Maybe he knew because he was there. The discussion continued. Outside the courthouse, the family waited. Reporters waited. The town waited. People who had followed the case for years watched every movement outside the building. The first hour passed. Then the second. Then the third. There was no verdict. The judge ordered a short recess. The jury continued deliberating. Inside, the jurors examined the physical evidence again. The photograph of Laura and Reed. The jacket. The forensic report. The cabin map. The old records. The handwritten page. The voice transcript. The case did not depend on one piece. That was becoming increasingly clear. The prosecution had constructed a chain. The defense had tried to break it at every link, but the links remained connected. One juror raised the issue of motive. Why would Reed kill Laura? The prosecution had argued obsession, rejection, control. The letters supported escalating hostility. Laura had attempted to end contact. She had written that she felt watched. She had documented her fear. Then she disappeared. The defense argued that motive was speculative. The jury agreed, but they also recognized something important. A motive did not need to be perfect. The question was whether Reed had committed the crime, and the evidence pointed in one direction. Late in the afternoon, the jury sent a note to the judge. They requested to hear the interrogation recording again. The courtroom filled immediately. Reed was brought back in. The recording played. The detective's voice. The questions. Reed's denials. Then the sentence. Did you find her? The audio stopped. Nobody spoke. The jury returned to deliberation. The family waited. Hours passed. As darkness settled outside the courthouse, the town lights came on. People gathered near the entrance. Some held photographs of Laura. Others held candles. A reporter described the scene as a community waiting for the past to speak. Inside the jury room, the decision was approaching. The foreperson asked each juror to state their position. One by one, they answered, guilty, guilty, guilty. One juror remained silent. The room stopped. The juror explained that the evidence was strong, but the uncertainty surrounding the DNA and voice recording created doubt. The others listened. No one pressured the juror. They returned to the evidence. The juror studied the map, the cabin, the quarry, the wooded road, the timeline. Then the juror asked a question. If Reed wasn't involved, why did he know where she was? Nobody answered immediately, because there was no easy alternative. The juror eventually nodded. Another vote was taken, this time unanimous. Guilty. The courthouse doors opened. The jury entered. Thomas Reed stood. Laura's family stood. The clerk read the verdict. Guilty. The words seemed to hang in the room. Reed did not react. Laura's mother covered her face. Her family held each other. There was no celebration, no cheering, only tears. 28 years of uncertainty had ended with one word, guilty. The judge then turned to sentencing. The prosecution requested the maximum penalty allowed under the law applicable to the conviction. The defense requested leniency, pointing to Reed's age and lack of a lengthy criminal history. The judge looked toward him. Mr. Reed, you have had many years to explain what happened. Reed remained silent. The judge continued. Today, you have an opportunity to speak. Reed finally looked up. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he spoke quietly. I didn't mean for it to happen. Laura's mother stared at him. The courtroom froze. The judge asked what he meant. Reed did not answer. The prosecutor stood. Are you admitting responsibility? Reed shook his head. No. It was another contradiction. Another half answer. Another piece of the mystery. The judge sentenced him to life in prison, but the sentence did not answer everything. It did not explain every movement. It did not explain why Laura had been taken. It did not explain what happened during the missing act. It did not explain how long Reed had planned the crime. And most importantly, it did not explain why he had waited nearly 30 years before finally allowing investigators to find her. After the hearing, reporters surrounded Laura's family. They asked how they felt. Laura's mother stood quietly. Then she said something that became the defining statement of the case. We finally know where she is. Not justice, not revenge, not closure, just where she was. For decades, that had been the missing answer. Laura had been somewhere beneath the Tennessee soil, somewhere beyond the reach of her family. Now they could bring her home. A memorial service was held several weeks later. People came from across the county. Some had known Laura. Others had never met her. They came because they remembered the photographs. They remembered the searches. They remembered the posters. They remembered the woman who vanished and the family that refused to stop looking. A photograph of Laura was placed beside flowers. Her mother touched the frame. Then the photograph was taken down. For the first time, it did not need to be used as a missing person poster. Laura was no longer missing. She had been found. The investigation, however, did not completely end with Reed's conviction. Detectives continued examining evidence to determine whether anyone else had helped him. The unknown DNA profile remained unresolved. Investigators believed it was likely unrelated, but they did not close that part of the file. They also examined the possibility that Reed had concealed additional evidence elsewhere. No second victim was identified. No second murder was proven. The case remained centered on Laura, one woman, one night, one man, and a secret that had survived for 28 years. The cold case unit later reviewed hundreds of other unsolved cases because the investigation had demonstrated the power of preserving old evidence. A receipt that seemed meaningless, a photograph that seemed ordinary, a fabric sample too small to test, a Cosette tape nobody wanted to play, a note written by a frightened young woman. None of them had solved the case alone. Together, they changed everything. The story became a warning for investigators. Do not assume old evidence is useless. Do not assume a case is impossible because witnesses have aged. Do not assume technology has reached its limit. And never assume a lie can survive forever. Thomas Reed had built his defense around time. 28 years had passed. He believed memories would fade. Records would disappear. Evidence would deteriorate. People would stop asking questions. He was right about some of it. But he was wrong about one thing. Laura's name did not disappear. Her family kept it alive. The evidence survived. And the investigation returned. Years after the verdict, the wooded road where Laura's jacket had been found remained quiet. Trees covered the old trail. The road was rarely used. There was no sign marking what happened there, but locals knew. Some still remembered the search. Some still remembered the night helicopters flew over the tree. Some remembered the volunteers walking through the rain. The place had become part of the town's memory, a location where a young woman's life had intersected with one of Tennessee's most haunting mysteries. And yet, despite the conviction, one question continued to bother investigators. What exactly had happened during the missing hour between Laura's last confirmed sighting and Reed's gasoline purchase? The evidence suggested a confrontation, but the precise sequence remained uncertain. The voice recording provided a fragment. Laura's jacket provided another. The biological evidence provided another. But the full story could never be reconstructed. Laura could no longer tell it. Reed refused to. That was the final cruelty of the case. The truth had been recovered only in pieces, and some pieces were gone forever. Years later, a detective involved in the reopened investigation returned to the evidence room. The old cardboard box was still there. Inside were the photographs, the map, the jacket documentation, the original receipts, the Cosette, the letters. He looked at the photograph of Laura one last time. He later said that the most important evidence in the case had never been the DNA. It had been persistence. Someone had kept the files. Someone had preserved the evidence. Someone had remembered the victim. Someone had reopened the case. And someone had finally asked the old questions again. What happened? Where did she go? Who knew? Who lied? And who believed that time would erase the truth? The answer had been waiting all along, not in one dramatic confession, not in one perfect fingerprint, not in one miraculous discovery. It was hidden inside ordinary things that had survived an extraordinary amount of time. A receipt, a photograph, a jacket, a voice, a note, a memory, and eventually a grave. That is what made the Tennessee case so disturbing. The killer had not been defeated by a mistake made on the night Laura disappeared. He had been defeated by the mistakes he believed time would allow him to survive. He thought the darkness would protect him. He thought the woods would confuse investigators. He thought 28 years would erase the evidence. Instead, every year added another layer to the story. The town changed. The roads changed. The buildings disappeared. People grew older. But the case remained. And when technology finally caught up with the evidence, the silence broke. Laura Bennett was no longer a photograph on a missing person poster. She was no longer a name whispered whenever old cold cases were discussed. She had been found. Her killer had been convicted. And the Tennessee community that had spent nearly 3 decades wondering what happened finally had an answer. But there was one final image that remained. Not the courtroom. Not the arrest. Not the evidence box. It was Laura's photograph. A young woman smiling before anyone knew what was coming. Before the disappearance. Before the searches. Before the headlines. Before the years of silence. Before the word cold case became attached to her name. She had been 22. She had a future. And for 28 years, that future was frozen in time. Then someone opened an old file, and the past came back. The killer had believed the case would die with the years. He was wrong. Because some cold cases are not dead. They are waiting. Waiting for technology. Waiting for one witness to remember. Waiting for one piece of evidence to survive. Waiting for someone to ask the question everyone else stopped asking. And in Tennessee, in a case that began in 1989, that question finally had an answer. Who killed Laura Bennett? The jury had answered. The evidence had answered. And after nearly 3 decades of silence, the name that had haunted the investigation was no longer hidden. Thomas Reed. The man who once disappeared into the crowd. The man who watched others search. The man who lied. The man who knew. And the man who finally ran out of time. The verdict should have been the end. For most people in the courtroom, it was. Thomas Reed had been convicted. The judge had imposed a life sentence. Laura Bennett had finally been found, identified, and returned to the family who had spent 28 years searching for her. The newspapers moved on. The cameras disappeared. The crowds outside the courthouse became smaller until, eventually, there was nothing left but an empty sidewalk and a few fading flowers. But for the detectives who had reopened the case, something still bothered them. The evidence had answered who. It had answered where. It had answered enough of the how. But there were gaps. Large ones. The missing hour remained. The unexplained second DNA profile remained. And one question continued to appear whenever investigators reviewed the original file. Why had Reed created the false trail in the wood? If he had already hidden Laura somewhere else, why drive toward the wooded road? Why leave the jacket there? Why allow his vehicle to be seen? Why risk creating evidence that might eventually point toward him? The answer, investigators believed, was psychological. Reed had not simply wanted Laura gone. He had wanted control over the story. That distinction became important. A killer who panics might leave evidence behind. A killer who plans may attempt to control what investigators believe happened. The wooded road had offered Reed an opportunity to manufacture a story. A jacket, a damaged sleeve, tire tracks, a remote location. Enough to suggest an attack, not enough to reveal what had actually happened. And for nearly 3 decades, investigators had followed the story he created. That realization haunted the retired detective. One of them returned to the original crime scene photographs years after the conviction. He spread them across a table. One image showed the jacket. Another showed the tire tracks. Another showed the surrounding woods. He stared at them for a long time. Then he noticed something. The jacket had been placed carefully between 2 trees. It was not simply thrown. One sleeve was folded beneath the body of the garment. The collar faced away from the road. At first, the positioning seemed meaningless. Now it looked deliberate. The detective enlarged the photograph. There were no obvious drag marks, no signs that the jacket had been pulled through the mud, no heavy disturbance beneath it. It had been placed there. The implication was chilling. Someone had wanted it found. The question was why. Perhaps Reed knew that investigators would search the area. Perhaps he understood that finding the jacket would convince them Laura had been attacked there. Perhaps he believed the absence of a body would force police into a prolonged search. And it worked. For days, investigators searched the wood. Volunteers joined. Dogs were brought in. Roads were closed. Families walked through the trees. Every hour spent searching that location was an hour not spent looking elsewhere. The deception had cost investigators time, and time was exactly what Reed needed. The cold case team later reconstructed the original search pattern. They discovered that officers had concentrated nearly 70% of their effort around the wooded road during the first 48 hours. That meant the real location where Laura had been concealed received far less attention. Nobody could know whether that difference had been intentional. But Reed's later behavior made the possibility difficult to ignore. He had watched the search. He had listened to investigators. He had followed the news. He knew exactly where police were looking. He knew what they had found. And he knew what they had not found. That knowledge explained the strange question during his 2017 interrogation. Did you find her? It was not merely a question. It was a glimpse into a memory Reed had spent decades trying to bury. But the investigation was not finished. The cold case unit reopened the mystery of the second DNA profile. They returned to Laura's clothing. The profile had been recovered from the inside of the jacket. At first, investigators believed it could have been transferred long before the disappearance. But after the conviction, they wanted certainty. They examined the garment under magnification. They found traces of dust, hair, and textile fiber. One fiber was consistent with a wool blend commonly used in men's coats during the late 1980s. The DNA profile was then compared against a list of men known to have had close contact with Laura. Nothing matched. Investigators expanded the search. Still nothing. The profile was not connected to Reed. It was not connected to any known suspect. For a moment, the possibility of an unknown accomplice returned. Could Reed have had help? Could another person have been involved in moving Laura? Could someone else have handled the jacket? The detectives did not want to leave the question unanswered. They reviewed Laura's final week, her workplace, her apartment, the diner, the convenience store, her evening classes, her friends, the people she had spoken to, the people who had visited her. The investigation produced a long list, but one name stood out. A co-worker named Paul Avery. He had been one of the last people to see Laura before her final shift. He had helped her carry a box to her car earlier that week. He had handled her coat. And he had been present at the medical office when Laura complained that someone was watching her. Investigators tested Avery. The profile did not match. He was eliminated. Then they tested another former co-worker. No match. Another friend. No match. A former boyfriend. No match. The profile remained unknown. Eventually, forensic experts concluded that the sample was too limited to establish when or how the biological material had been transferred. It might have belonged to someone who had touched the jacket months earlier. It might have come from a public location. It might have been transferred indirectly. The mystery remained, but the detectives refused to let it distract from what the evidence had already established. Reed was responsible for Laura's murder. The unresolved profile did not change that conclusion. Still, the existence of unexplained evidence became part of the case's permanent shadow. There was another mystery, the missing hour. Investigators knew Reed purchased gasoline at 9:06 p.m. They knew Laura had been seen near the insurance office. They knew the dark sedan had been observed, but they did not know precisely where Laura was between those moments. A forensic reconstruction suggested that Reed could have driven from the convenience store to the wooded road in less than 10 minutes. He could then have remained there briefly. He could have traveled toward the quarry, and from there he could have reached the cabin. But the reconstruction could not tell investigators exactly what happened. There were no cameras, no GPS, no digital records, no cell phone tower data, no automatic license plate reader. In 1989, the night belonged to darkness. A person could drive 10 miles without leaving a digital trace. A car could disappear down a rural road and become invisible. A telephone call could be made without a record of the conversation. A receipt could survive only because someone happened to file it. That was the world Reed had relied upon. It was also the world that had nearly protected him forever. The reopened investigation showed just how much had changed. In 1989, investigators had fingerprints and photographs. In the modern investigation, they had advanced DNA analysis, digital image enhancement, voice comparison, geographic reconstruction, computerized records, modern forensic anthropology, evidence databases. Technology had not created the truth. It had exposed the truth that had already been sitting inside the evidence. That realization became the central lesson of the case. The past does not always disappear. Sometimes it simply becomes harder to read. The family understood that better than anyone. After the conviction, Laura's mother returned to the place where the remains had been recovered. She stood alone. There were no reporters, no cameras, no courtroom, just trees. She carried a small photograph of Laura. For several minutes, she said nothing. Then she placed the photograph against a tree. She had spent years searching for her daughter. Now she no longer needed to search. That should have brought peace. Instead, it brought something more complicated: grief. Because finding Laura meant accepting that she was never coming home. For decades, hope had been painful, but hope had also kept the family moving. Now hope was replaced by certainty, and certainty could hurt in ways uncertainty never had. The family eventually created a small memorial. There was no grand monument, just Laura's name, her birth year, the year she disappeared, and a short sentence: remembered, always. People visited quietly. Some left flowers. Some left handwritten notes. Others simply stood there. The case had become part of the town's history, but it was not the kind of history people celebrated. It was the kind they remembered when the roads became quiet, when the weather turned cold, when someone mentioned 1989, when an old photograph surfaced, when a missing person poster was found inside a forgotten drawer. The phrase cold case had once described Laura's investigation. Now it meant something else. It represented time. 28 years of silence. 28 years of questions. 28 years in which the killer lived a life while Laura's family lived inside a mystery. That imbalance was one of the most difficult parts for investigators to accept. Reed had not spent 28 years in prison. He had not spent 28 years answering questions. He had spent those years living, working, eating dinner, sleeping, attending family events, watching television, walking through stores, passing strangers who had no idea what he had done. Meanwhile, Laura's family had carried the same question every morning: where is she? That difference became even more painful when investigators discovered one final detail about Reed's life after 1989. He had kept a newspaper clipping. It was not the original front page about Laura's disappearance. It was a later article discussing the failure to solve the case. The clipping had been folded several times. Investigators found it among his personal possessions after his arrest. There was no handwriting on it, no annotation, nothing obvious. But the article contained one sentence that made detectives uncomfortable. Police had admitted they had no idea where Laura was. Reed had kept that sentence for years. Why? Was it proof of guilt? Not by itself. Could a person keep an old article for innocent reasons? Yes, but in context, it became another strange detail, another piece of the pattern. The detectives studied the clipping. Then they put it back into the evidence box. The truth about Reed was now settled in court, but the psychology of his behavior remained disturbing. Why keep the article? Why attend searches? Why watch the family suffer? Why return to the cabin? Why ask whether Laura had been found? Why preserve a story that could eventually expose him? There was no complete answer. Some killers want control. Some become obsessed with their own crime. Some believe they are smarter than investigators. Some simply assume they will never be caught. Reed may have believed all four, but there was something he could not control: time. Time changed the technology. Time changed the investigator. Time changed the evidence. And time changed him. The young man who had been questioned in 1989 was gone. The older man sitting in court decades later could not outrun what his younger self had done. The case had followed him quietly. It had survived inside boxes, inside photographs, inside memories, inside laboratory samples, inside a cassette tape, inside the words of a frightened young woman, and eventually it followed him into a courtroom. The final report from the cold case unit described the investigation as a successful reconstruction of a historical homicide, but investigators used a simpler phrase among themselves. The case remembered, because that was what had happened. The town remembered. The family remembered. The evidence remembered. And eventually the investigation remembered how to ask the right questions. Yet one detail still bothered the lead detective: the cassette recording. He had listened to it dozens of times. The woman: "Please, just leave me alone." The man: "Get in the car." The car door. The background noise. The distance. The uncertainty. The recording could never tell the entire story, but it had captured something real. A moment. A voice. A command. A final fragment of Laura's life. The detective once described it as a door that had been left open for 28 years. Nobody knew what had happened immediately after the recording, but now they knew where the story ended. Laura was gone. Reed was responsible. The family had her back, and the cold case was closed, at least officially, because some mysteries never completely close. They leave behind questions that cannot be answered. What did Laura see in those final minutes? Did she know she was in danger? Did she realize Reed intended to hurt her? Did she fight? Did she plead? Did she believe someone would find her? No record can answer those questions. No laboratory can recover them. No courtroom can reconstruct them perfectly. That is the cruelest limitation of a cold case. Evidence can tell investigators what happened. Sometimes it can tell them who did it, but it cannot restore the final moments of a life. Laura's story ended in darkness, but her disappearance did not end there. It continued through 28 years of searching, through a town that refused to completely forget, through detectives who reopened old boxes, through evidence that survived longer than anyone expected, and through a family that kept asking the same question: where is she? Eventually, they received the answer, and somewhere in Tennessee, the old files were returned to storage. The cardboard box was closed. The cassette was labeled. The photographs were archived. The forensic reports were finalized. The name Thomas Reed was attached to the case, and Laura Bennett's name was no longer listed as missing. The cold case was cracked. The killer had been unmasked. But the silence of that Tennessee night in 1989 remained, because even after justice arrived, there were things the years had taken that no courtroom could ever return: a future, a voice, a life, and a young woman who should have grown old. The case was officially closed, but the story did not disappear. In Blackridge, people continued to talk about what happened to Laura Bennett because the conviction had answered the central question without answering every question. Thomas Reed was in prison. Laura had been found. The jury had spoken, yet the town still carried the memory of the night when a young woman vanished and an entire community discovered how quickly an ordinary evening could become a nightmare. The cold case had become part of local history, but for Laura's family, history was not something safely buried in the past. It was personal. It existed in photographs, old clothes, birthday cards, handwritten notes, and the empty spaces that had remained inside their home for decades. After the trial, Laura's mother began sorting through her daughter's belongings. She had avoided some of the boxes for years. There were clothes Laura had left behind, books, photographs, a small collection of letters, receipts from places Laura had visited, a calendar from 1989. On one page, Laura had written a reminder: "Call Mom." The handwriting was ordinary. The date was ordinary. But Laura never made that call. Her mother kept staring at those two words: "Call Mom." A future interrupted by violence. A simple reminder that became a permanent wound. Meanwhile, investigators continued reviewing the case for one reason. They wanted to know whether Reed had acted alone. The conviction had not proven that anyone else was involved, but several details remained unexplained. The second DNA profile, the movement of Laura's remains, the missing hour, the strange placement of the jacket, and the possibility that Reed had used more than one location to confuse investigators. The cold case unit requested access to every surviving piece of evidence. They examined the old photographs again. They reviewed the original handwritten reports. They listened to the cassette. They read every witness statement. They reconstructed Reed's movements from the beginning. One investigator noticed something buried inside a 1989 interview. A witness had reported seeing two vehicles near the wooded road. The second vehicle had been described as a light-colored pickup. The original detective had dismissed the statement because the witness could not identify the driver. Now investigators reconsidered it. They searched vehicle registration records from 1989. Several pickups fit the description. One belonged to a man named Charles Dyer. Dyer had worked with Reed. He had also visited the cabin property. For several days, investigators wondered whether they had found a hidden accomplice, but the evidence did not hold. Dyer's employment records placed him at a construction site that night. His supervisor confirmed it. His vehicle mileage records were consistent. And most importantly, forensic testing excluded him from the unknown DNA profile. He was eliminated. Another possible lead collapsed. Then investigators discovered something more mundane. The light-colored pickup belonged to a utility worker. He had been repairing a power line nearby. His work records confirmed that he had been on the road that evening. The second vehicle was innocent. But the discovery reinforced a larger lesson. Cold cases are filled with false patterns. Every suspicious detail can lead somewhere. And sometimes it leads nowhere. That was why investigators had to separate possibility from proof. Reed's case had survived because the evidence pointing toward him was stronger than the alternatives. The alternative suspects had explanation. Reed had contradictions. The distinction mattered. The team returned to the unknown DNA profile. Eventually, they discovered that the sample might have been introduced during a medical examination before Laura disappeared. The profile belonged to a man who had worked at the medical office where Laura was employed. He had handled clothing during a routine procedure. The DNA was not connected to the murder. The mystery was finally resolved. Another shadow disappeared from the case. The investigation now had fewer unanswered questions, but one remained. What had happened inside Reed's vehicle? The prosecution's theory suggested Laura had been forced inside after an argument, but there was no direct evidence of what happened afterward. Investigators searched the old vehicle records. Reed's sedan had been destroyed years earlier. There was nothing left to test. The mechanic had kept only a small piece of fabric. The interior had been cleaned. Any physical evidence inside the vehicle was long gone. That was another consequence of time. The case had survived. The car had not. The road had changed. The cabin had disappeared. Witnesses had aged. Some had died. Some could no longer remember. The physical world had moved forward while the evidence struggled to keep up. But one thing remained. Laura's word. The page she had written. The warning. The fear. The investigators believed those words explained why she had been vulnerable. She knew Reed. She had trusted him. She knew his temper. She had underestimated what he was capable of. That made the case particularly disturbing. There had been no random stranger hiding behind a tree. There had been someone inside Laura's circle. Someone who knew her. Someone who knew how to approach her without causing immediate alarm. Someone who understood that trust could open a door that force could not. The psychological analysis of Reed's behavior became part of the final investigative report. It described patterns of control, possessiveness, escalating jealousy, denial, manipulation, and post-crime behavior designed to distance himself from suspicion. Investigators noted that Reed did not behave like someone desperately trying to leave town. He stayed. He participated in searches. He answered questions. He gave an alibi. He became part of the investigation. That behavior had initially made him appear less suspicious, but it may have been precisely what allowed him to remain free. He understood the power of appearing cooperative. He knew that investigators expected suspects to run. He did not run. He stayed close. He watched. He waited. And he allowed the investigation to move in the wrong direction. That strategy worked for years, then decades, but not forever. The story eventually reached a national audience. Documentaries examined the case. Podcasts revisited the timeline. Former investigators discussed the evidence. The public debated whether the original investigation should have identified Reed early. Some argued that he should have been arrested in 1989. Others believed the evidence simply had not been strong enough. Both sides had a point. The original investigators had suspected Reed, but suspicion without physical evidence would not necessarily have resulted in a conviction. The DNA did not exist in usable form. The voice recording had not been analyzed. The cabin connection had not been understood. The receipt had not been linked to the timeline. The old letters had not been properly interpreted. Modern technology had changed the balance. That became one of the most important lessons from the case. A cold case does not always become solvable because investigators discover something new. Sometimes it becomes solvable because old evidence becomes readable. The distinction is enormous. The evidence was not born in the modern era. It had been waiting for better testing, better databases, better imaging, better questions, and better patience. The case also changed how the local department handled old investigations. Evidence storage procedures were updated. Old biological samples were cataloged. Unresolved cases were digitized. Archived records were scanned. Investigators created new protocols for reviewing cases that had been considered impossible. Laura's case became a reference point, not because it was unique, because it was a warning. If one forgotten sample could help solve a murder nearly 30 years later, what other cases might still contain answers? The cold case unit began reopening files. Some produced nothing. Others produced new leads. A few produced arrests. The work continued. But Laura remained the case everyone remembered, because it had been so long, because the killer had lived normally for decades, because the family had refused to stop searching, and because the evidence had survived. One afternoon, a detective returned to the memorial. The place was quiet. Leaves moved across the ground. Someone had left fresh flowers. He stood there for a few minutes. Then he noticed a small handwritten note. It had been left beneath Laura's photograph. It said, "You were never forgotten." That sentence captured what the entire investigation had ultimately become. Laura had never been forgotten. Not by her family. Not by the people who searched. Not by the detectives who reopened the file. Not by the community. And not by the evidence. The years had buried many things, but they had not buried the question, where is Laura Bennett? That question had survived longer than Thomas Reed expected, and when the answer finally came, it changed the meaning of every year that had passed. The missing person posters were removed. The old hotline number was disconnected. The photographs no longer needed to be distributed. Laura was no longer a missing woman. She was a victim, a daughter, a friend, a name attached to a grave, and a reminder of how fragile ordinary life can be. The case also changed Laura's family. They no longer spent birthdays wondering whether someone might call. They no longer waited for a stranger to knock on the door. They no longer imagined Laura walking back into the room. The uncertainty was gone. The grief remained. But grief and uncertainty are different. Uncertainty keeps the wound open. Grief allows the wound to exist without demanding an answer every morning. That was the closest thing to closure the family ever received. Not happiness, not forgetting, just certainty. Years later, a journalist asked Laura's mother whether she believed the verdict gave her justice. She thought about it. Then she said she did not know. Justice could not return 28 years. It could not return her daughter. It could not erase the photographs of the search. It could not erase the birthdays Laura missed. It could not erase the years spent wondering whether she was alive. But it gave Laura a name. It gave her a place. And it gave the family the truth. Sometimes that is all a cold case can offer. The final chapter of the investigation was written quietly. No dramatic chase. No confession. No final confrontation. Just paperwork. Evidence inventories. Court records. A conviction entered into the system. and a file marked closed. But the detective who had reopened the case refused to describe it as an end. He called it a return. The case had returned to where it belonged, with Laura, not with the killer, not with the rumors, not with the mystery, with the victim. That became the final message investigators wanted people to remember. Cold cases are not stories about old crime. They are stories about people who are still waiting for answers. They are about evidence that refuses to disappear. They are about families who continue living beside unanswered questions. And they are about the possibility that somewhere inside an old box, an old photograph, or an old laboratory sample, the truth is still alive. Laura's truth had waited 28 years. It waited through rain, through changing roads, through forgotten files, through retirement, through new generations of detectives. It waited while Thomas Reed built a life around a secret. Then one day, the evidence began speaking. The jacket spoke. The receipt spoke. The record spoke. The DNA spoke. The recording spoke. And eventually, the courtroom spoke. Guilty. One word. A word that could never restore what had been taken, but a word that finally ended the question. Who killed Laura Bennett? Thomas Reed. Where was Laura? At the old cabin property. Why had the case remained unsolved? Because the evidence had been fragmented, the original investigation had followed a false trail, and the technology needed to connect the pieces did not yet exist. How was the cold case finally cracked? Not through one miracle, through persistence, through evidence that survived, through investigators willing to look again, and through a family that never stopped asking. The town eventually grew quieter. The headlines faded. The documentaries stopped. The cameras moved to other stories. But the memorial remained, and Laura's name remained. Every year, someone still left flowers. Every year, someone still remembered the young woman who disappeared in 1989. The case was closed. The killer was behind bars. But the memory did not need a courtroom. It lived in the people who remembered her. It lived in the photographs. It lived in the old records. It lived in the quiet Tennessee roads where the investigation began. And perhaps that was the most important thing the cold case had revealed. A murderer can hide a body. A murderer can hide a weapon. A murderer can hide a story. But hiding the truth forever is much harder because evidence can sleep for decades. And then, without warning, it can wake up. That is what happened in Tennessee. A cold case woke up. A forgotten photograph became evident. A forgotten receipt became a timeline. A forgotten voice became a clue. A forgotten sample became DNA. A forgotten note became a warning. And a man who believed the past was buried discovered that the past had been waiting for him. Thomas Reed had spent 28 years believing that Laura Bennett's disappearance belonged to another time. But the evidence never forgot. The town never completely forgot. And Laura's family never forgot. In the end, that was why the case was solved. Not because the past disappeared, because the past refused to stay silent.